The courtroom was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you question whether anyone is still breathing. Every eye in the room was focused on the judge, a stern, middle-aged man with a steel-gray mustache and an air of authority that could crush anyone who dared challenge him. He shuffled papers on his desk, preparing to deliver what seemed like another dull ruling in the long-standing case before him. His every motion was deliberate, calculated, as if nothing could disturb his unwavering control. The lawyers, poised with their legal jargon and polished suits, stood at the ready, awaiting the judge's instructions. Their voices were low, only rising when absolutely necessary. The tension in the air was thick. This was no ordinary case. It was a case involving organized crime, high stakes, and more than a few lives hanging in the balance. But none of that seemed to faze the judge. Then, something happened. Something that would change everything. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director known for his steely-eyed characters, stood up from his seat in the back of the courtroom. His presence was immediate, commanding, as it always was. The man had a reputation that stretched beyond Hollywood. He wasn't just a famous actor anymore. Clint Eastwood was a force, a symbol of unflinching resolve. He had that look, the kind that made even the toughest criminals reconsider their life choices when they were caught in his gaze. He wasn't here as a spectator or some celebrity hoping to make a quick cameo. No, Clint Eastwood was here for a reason, though no one in the room could have predicted what would come next. The judge, clearly unaware of who he was dealing with, chuckled under his breath, making a snide comment about Clint's role in the ongoing case. "What are you doing here, Mr. Eastwood? Are you planning on starring in this drama?" The judge sneered, clearly amused by Clint's presence. The courtroom filled with a few awkward chuckles, as if the judge's joke had lightened the mood. But Clint didn't smile. He didn't even blink. Instead, Clint's eyes narrowed slightly, the kind of look that made people second-guess everything they thought they knew about him. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room, his steps echoing in the hushed silence. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn leather jacket, a jacket that had seen more action than most people's wardrobes combined. As everyone watched, Clint pulled out a small, shiny object, a badge. The golden emblem gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, the kind of badge that only a select few ever had the privilege of carrying. It wasn't just any badge. It was the USSS badge, the United States Secret Service. The room froze. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The judge, still sitting at the bench, stared at the badge with wide eyes, his face draining of color. His smile, once smug and dismissive, faded quickly. The chuckles in the courtroom disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. What had just happened? Why was Clint Eastwood flashing a USSS badge in a public courtroom? The other lawyers in the room exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if they'd misinterpreted what they had just witnessed. The media in the back row, who had been filming the proceedings, paused, cameras still in mid-swipe, unsure if they should continue recording. The audience, those sitting in the gallery, those watching from home, was now on edge. Clint Eastwood stood there, calm and composed, as if this moment was just another day in the life of someone used to the spotlight. He held the badge in front of him, allowing everyone to see it, the shiny seal glinting in the light. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that made the judge's knees feel weak. "I suggest you rethink your words." The judge opened his mouth to speak, but quickly closed it, unsure of how to respond. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing down at his desk, as if the papers before him could somehow offer an escape. But there was no escape. Clint's words hung in the air like a ticking bomb, threatening to detonate at any moment. The room was electric. Every person present could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, Clint did something unexpected. He didn't yell, didn't demand an apology, didn't threaten the judge. He simply waited. He let the weight of the situation speak for itself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The judge, who had prided himself on being in control, was now visibly shaken. He had underestimated Clint Eastwood, and it was clear he was regretting that decision. The entire room, from the lawyers to the gallery, seemed to be holding its collective breath. Clint's expression didn't waver. It was the same expression he had worn countless times on the big screen, the kind of look that made even the toughest criminals question their every move. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life, and Clint was no longer playing a role. For years, Clint Eastwood had kept his connection to the United States Secret Service hidden under wraps. Few knew about the covert operations he had been a part of, the lives he had saved, and the intelligence he had gathered. In fact, very few knew that Clint had spent years working alongside some of the most elite agents in the country, all while continuing his successful career in Hollywood. But today, that secret was out. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. He adjusted his glasses and squinted at Clint. I wasn't aware. Clint held up a hand, cutting him off. You weren't aware of much, it seems, he said, his voice sharp, but not unkind. But now you are. The silence stretched on, heavy with anticipation. What would happen next? Would Clint explain himself further? Or would he simply walk out of the courtroom and leave everyone wondering what just transpired? For the first time in what seemed like forever, the judge looked unsure. He didn't know how to handle this. He didn't know how to handle Clint Eastwood. The room was frozen in a moment of suspense, waiting for the next move. Clint, ever the master of control, took a step back, as if this was merely the beginning of something much larger. And in that moment, everyone knew one thing for sure. Things were about to get much more complicated. The courtroom would never be the same. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom still hummed with a quiet, uneasy tension as Clint Eastwood slowly returned to his seat. The weight of his earlier gesture, flashing that USSS badge, had not yet fully settled in. The eyes of everyone in the room were locked on him, trying to figure out exactly who this man was and what he was really doing here. But Clint wasn't just some Hollywood legend, playing a role for the cameras. There was so much more to him than what the world knew. Clint's life had never been ordinary, and it certainly wasn't ordinary now. As the son of a steelworker in the small town of San Francisco, Clint Eastwood's humble beginnings weren't unlike the characters he would later portray on the big screen. Tough, determined, and never willing to back down from a challenge. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and the streets were lined with reminders of struggle, Clint learned early on that survival meant more than just physical strength. It meant mental toughness, resilience, and the ability to stay calm when chaos was swirling around you. It was no surprise that Clint joined the military as a young man, an eager 18-year-old looking for purpose and discipline. He served in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, a formative experience that deeply impacted him. Those years on the front lines taught him the value of loyalty, duty, and sacrifice, lessons he would carry with him throughout his entire life. The war had hardened him in ways that only those who had experienced the brutality of battle could understand. And it was here that Clint began to learn the intricacies of handling high-pressure situations, a skill that would serve him well in both his acting career and, more secretly, in the shadowy world of national security. Clint returned from the war in the early 1950s, but the civilian world was a stark contrast to the one he had left behind. With a military background and no real connections in Hollywood, Clint struggled to make ends meet. His early years in the industry were full of rejection and disappointment. He appeared in small, uncredited roles, some of which were barely noticeable on screen. But Clint never gave up. He knew his value. And, like many of the characters he would later portray, he simply kept pushing forward, refusing to be sidelined. By the early 1960s, Clint had finally made a name for himself. His role in Rawhide, a popular Western TV series, made him a household name, but it was a fistful of dollars in 1964 that truly launched his career. His portrayal of the enigmatic man with no name in Sergio Leone's spaghetti Western trilogy cemented his place as a pop culture icon. The rough, gritty image Clint had cultivated on screen resonated with audiences across the globe. But what most people didn't know was that Clint's on-screen persona wasn't the only thing that was tough. Behind the scenes, Clint had been recruited by the U.S. government for work with the Secret Service, a clandestine operation that relied on his fame and his ability to blend into high-profile environments. While the world saw Clint as a beloved actor and director, a different Clint was emerging in the shadows, one who had quietly worked on multiple undercover missions, providing intelligence and assistance during critical moments. Clint's connection to the Secret Service was something he had kept under wraps for years. Few knew about his involvement in sensitive government operations, and he preferred it that way. His fame, his celebrity status, and his reputation on screen had made him an ideal candidate to gather information and observe situations that would have otherwise been difficult to infiltrate. There were moments when Clint found himself face to face with powerful politicians, dangerous criminals, and covert operations that involved everything from espionage to national security. His experiences on set, his ability to remain calm, his sharp instinct, had prepared him for these high-stakes situations more than anything else. But Clint's involvement with the Secret Service was never easy. He had seen firsthand the darker side of American politics and power, and it had shaped his view of the world. He didn't trust easily, especially not those who wore a badge or carried power over others. His years of service with the Secret Service had exposed him to corruption, betrayal, and manipulation, things he could never forget. Yet, for Clint, the mission always came first. Even when his personal life suffered, he kept his focus on the job at hand. His most recent assignment, which had brought him into the courtroom that day, was one of the most complex and dangerous he had ever faced. The case involved a network of high-ranking individuals involved in organized crime, corruption, and black market dealings with global implications. The investigation was top secret, and Clint had been brought in as an undercover agent, leveraging his status to move between the powerful figures involved. What most people didn't know was that Clint had spent years working behind the scenes to gather intelligence, acting as both a protector and a silent observer of those who were unaware of his true purpose. He had been involved in operations to protect government officials, high-profile celebrities, and other targets at risk. But now, this case had pushed him to the limits of his endurance. The courtroom drama that had unfolded that morning was just the tip of the iceberg. Clint had been called in to help untangle a conspiracy involving powerful criminals and government insiders, and the judge, who had so casually mocked him just moments ago, was unknowingly a part of it. Clint had seen it coming. His instincts told him that things were about to escalate. As Clint sat quietly, reflecting on his past, his thoughts drifted back to the investigation. The case was delicate, and the lives of several innocent people hung in the balance. If the judge and the rest of the courtroom didn't understand the seriousness of the situation, they would soon find out. Clint's next steps would not only expose the judge's role in the conspiracy, but also uncover a much larger plot involving the highest levels of government. Clint's backstory wasn't just about his rise to fame, the tough roles he had played, or the famous Dirty Harry persona. His true story was one of sacrifice, service, and a deep commitment to protecting the very country that had given him everything. But this story, this mission, was far from over. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before, and Clint knew the road ahead would only get more dangerous. As Clint sat in that courtroom, the weight of his past experiences felt heavier than ever. His role in the investigation was far from finished, and the judge's earlier dismissal? It would soon prove to be the least of his worries. The world of politics, crime, and betrayal had just collided with Clint Eastwood, and things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. The audience, sitting quietly in their seats, waiting for the next chapter to unfold, had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole went, and Clint knew that only time would tell if they could make it out unscathed. Clint sat silently as the room around him buzzed with murmurs. The judge had reluctantly cleared his throat, attempting to regain some semblance of authority, but the tension in the courtroom was undeniable. His earlier dismissive remark to Clint Eastwood, now flashing a USSS badge, had done more than just insult a Hollywood legend. It had placed him, and everyone in the room, directly in the path of a storm they were not prepared for. Clint knew that the sudden appearance of his badge in the courtroom had caught everyone off guard. The air was thick with uncertainty as people tried to piece together the gravity of what had just happened. Some lawyers still looked confused, while others were beginning to realize the depth of Clint's involvement in this high-stakes case. But for Clint, this wasn't just about making a statement. It was about signaling that the stakes were about to get much higher. The judge, clearly rattled, had ordered a brief recess, his attempts to regain control failing as Clint's presence in the room continued to cast a shadow over the proceedings. As people filed out of the courtroom, some glanced at Clint with suspicion, others with admiration. He was used to the stares, the whispers, and the curiosity that followed him. But this was different. This wasn't the usual, "Hey, there's Clint Eastwood" type of attention. This was fear. This was the realization that they were all now part of something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. Outside the courtroom, Clint leaned against the cold stone wall, his eyes scanning the hallway. The building was quiet now, but Clint had always had a sense that things could change in an instant. The investigation he was involved in had taken an unexpected turn. What had started as an attempt to expose a corrupt network of criminals had now shifted into something far more dangerous. A conspiracy so deep that even the highest levels of government might be involved. The USSS badge was a powerful symbol, but Clint didn't rely on its shine to intimidate. He knew what was at stake. People's lives were on the line, and the consequences of exposing the truth were far from predictable. Clint had worked in the shadows long enough to understand that once a door was opened, it couldn't be closed again. In this case, this operation was about to go public in a way that no one was prepared for. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise behind him. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing as two figures approached, a man and a woman. Both were dressed in business attire, their faces stern but calm, a stark contrast to the chaos Clint had just left behind in the courtroom. "Clint," the man said, his voice low and controlled. "We need to talk." Clint recognized him immediately. Special Agent Thomas Hayes, a trusted member of the USSS, and his partner, Agent Sarah Lawson, a sharp and calculating operative. The two had been working with Clint for years, coordinating covert operations and providing intelligence support during his various missions. But something in their eyes told Clint that things were far more complicated now. "Clint, this case has escalated beyond what we thought," Sarah continued, her gaze darting around the hallway, ensuring no one was eavesdropping. "The judge you just confronted, Judge McAllister, he's in deeper than we initially suspected. His connections," she paused, her voice tightening, "they run much higher than we thought." Clint's expression remained unreadable, but inside, a sinking feeling began to settle. He had suspected that McAllister was more than just a corrupt judge, but hearing it confirmed was a stark reminder of how dangerous this case had become. "We've uncovered a network," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "McAllister's ties to organized crime are just the beginning. The real danger comes from the politicians he's been working with. Some of them are deep in bed with international crime syndicates. We're talking about a web of corruption that reaches into the highest offices in the country." Clint exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He had known that this investigation was a powder keg waiting to explode, but now the pieces were falling into place. What had started as an isolated case involving criminal activity had now turned into a full-blown conspiracy, and Clint had been dragged right into the heart of it. "We need to get McAllister to talk," Sarah said, her voice firm, "but it's not going to be easy. He's already on high alert, and now that he knows you're involved, he'll be even more careful." Clint ran a hand through his hair, his mind churning as he considered their options. McAllister was a powerful figure. Getting to him wouldn't be easy, but Clint had dealt with far more dangerous enemies in the past. The real question was who could be trusted in all of this. If McAllister's web of corruption spread that far, it was impossible to know who was loyal and who was compromised. "We can't waste any more time," Clint said finally, his voice low and resolute. "If we're going to take him down, we need to move fast." Thomas and Sarah exchanged a glance, both understanding the gravity of Clint's words. There was no turning back now. What Clint had just started, with that single flash of his USSS badge in the courtroom, was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and it was going to be a storm that tore apart everything they thought they knew. "Then let's get to work," Hayes said, his voice sharp. With that, the three of them turned and made their way down the hallway, their footsteps echoing against the walls as they moved toward the next phase of the operation. The conflict was rising now, the stakes higher than ever before. Clint could feel it in his bones. The inevitable confrontation was coming, and the truth would have to be exposed, no matter the cost. As Clint walked, His thoughts flashed back to the moment he had stepped into that courtroom, badge in hand. It had been a gamble, a risky move, one that had shaken the foundation of everything around him. But he had made his decision, and now he had to see it through. There was no turning back. The game was on, and Clint Eastwood was ready to play. The pieces were in motion. The storm was on the horizon. And as Clint prepared for what was coming next, he couldn't help but wonder, who would survive when the dust finally settled? The conflict was far from over, and Clint, as always, was right in the center of it. The days following Clint's confrontation in the courtroom were a blur of tension and constant movement. Each moment felt like an endless march, each step taking him deeper into the heart of a conspiracy that threatened to topple everything he knew. But Clint had always been a man who thrived under pressure. When things went sideways, that was when he was at his best. Clint, Thomas, and Sarah quickly moved into action, gathering intel on Judge McAllister's known associates. Every conversation felt like a potential trap. Every phone call, a chance for someone to find out just how deep Clint was involved. The threat loomed over them constantly, but it only fueled Clint's resolve. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Their first move was to gain access to McAllister's personal files. Clint's connections within the Secret Service had always provided him with valuable resources, and this time was no different. They had secured a high-tech team to hack into the judge's private records, hoping to find something, anything, that would tie him to the larger web of criminal activity they were trying to dismantle. The information came in slowly, drip by drip. Each new document raised more questions than answers, but Clint could feel the pieces starting to come together. But it wasn't just McAllister's connections they had to worry about. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered about the political figures involved, high-ranking officials who were compromised, who had used their positions for personal gain, working with international crime syndicates, laundering money, and influencing policy. Clint had always known there was a shadowy underworld pulling the strings behind the scenes. But to see it laid out in front of him, in black and white, made it all the more real and all the more dangerous. One night, after a long day of digging through documents and surveillance footage, Clint and his team sat around a small conference table in a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across their faces as they reviewed what they had found. "This goes deeper than we thought," Sarah said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. She had been up for hours, poring over the files they had hacked, trying to find any direct link to the criminals they were chasing. "We're talking about key people in multiple government agencies. This isn't just about McAllister anymore. We have a whole network to dismantle." Clint nodded, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the table. "It's always been bigger than just one person. The judge is just a pawn in a much larger game. We need to get to the top of the pyramid, but we don't have much time." Thomas leaned forward, glancing at Clint. "What's the next step, Clint? We're running out of leads. If we don't make a move soon, they'll close ranks, and we'll be back to square one." Clint's gaze hardened, his mind working quickly. He had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. He knew the risks. If they didn't act fast, they risked losing everything. "We need to bring McAllister in. Force his hand. If we get him under pressure, he'll have no choice but to give up the names of those above him," Clint said, his voice calm but determined. "We'll need to be careful. One wrong move, and this whole thing could blow up in our faces." They all exchanged glances. Clint could see the uncertainty in their eyes. The stakes had never been higher. But Clint wasn't one to flinch when the stakes were raised. He had faced down worse odds before. He wasn't about to back down now. The plan was set into motion that very night. Under the cover of darkness, Clint and his team prepared for their next move. They would confront McAllister in a way he never expected, using the very same tactics that had earned Clint his reputation in the first place. It was a calculated risk, but Clint knew there was no other choice. They had to get the judge to talk. The location for the confrontation was a quiet, upscale hotel on the edge of the city, chosen specifically for its privacy and the way it offered easy access for both Clint and McAllister to come and go unnoticed. The plan was to set a trap. Clint would take the role of a neutral party, someone offering McAllister a way out, all the while giving his team the chance to gather evidence that would confirm the judge's connections to the larger conspiracy. The tension in the air was palpable as Clint entered the hotel room, his footsteps echoing on the polished floors. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. This was the moment that could either expose the entire operation or send them into a downward spiral. Clint sat at a small table in the center of the room, waiting. He had to remain calm. He couldn't afford to show any signs of weakness, no matter how many questions raced through his mind. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and there stood Judge McAllister, a look of confusion and suspicion written across his face. "I didn't expect you to come to me, Clint," McAllister said, his voice gruff, his eyes scanning the room suspiciously. "I thought we had an understanding." Clint gave a small, measured smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. "We do have an understanding, Judge, but you and I both know that it's time for the truth to come out. All of it." McAllister took a cautious step into the room, his hand hovering near the door as if he was already considering making a run for it. But Clint wasn't about to let him go. "Not now. You think you can just waltz in here and make demands?" McAllister growled, his voice growing defensive. Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to make demands. I'm here to give you a choice. You can help us, and we'll make sure your involvement is minimized. Or you can stay silent, and we'll make sure the whole world knows exactly what you've been doing." The room fell silent, the weight of Clint's words hanging in the air. For a moment, Clint could see the fear in McAllister's eyes. The judge was realizing the gravity of the situation. He had thought he was untouchable, but Clint had made sure that wasn't the case. Clint wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to make a statement. McAllister hesitated, his face twitching with uncertainty. But Clint had already planted the seed. Now it was only a matter of time before McAllister would have to make his choice. Clint's journey had just taken another unpredictable turn. What had started as a quiet investigation had now become a full-blown operation, with the potential to bring down powerful forces. The path ahead was unclear, but Clint was ready for whatever came next. The trap had been set. The next move was McAllister's. And Clint knew that this time, there was no turning back. The silence that hung in the room was deafening. McAllister's eyes darted between Clint and the door, as if weighing his options. For a man who had lived a life of power and corruption, his moment of reckoning had arrived. Clint knew how this game worked. Fear was a potent tool, and McAllister was learning that the hard way. "I don't have time for this," McAllister muttered, his voice shaky but laced with defiance. "You think you can intimidate me? I've seen far worse than whatever you think you're doing here." Clint, unmoved, leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You've been part of something much bigger than you realized, Judge. And now, it's catching up with you. No one's untouchable. Not even you." The judge took a step toward the door but stopped short, his gaze flicking to Clint once again. The man was visibly sweating now, his earlier bravado starting to crack under the pressure. Clint could see it. McAllister was scared. McAllister began, but Clint cut him off. "No more lies," Clint said, his voice sharp, commanding. "You don't get to walk away from this. The people you've been protecting, the deals you've made, they're going to fall apart, one way or another." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of McAllister's shallow breaths filling the air. The tension was thick, the room seemingly shrinking as they both stood at the precipice of what was to come. Then, the judge spoke. His voice, now small and trembling, was nothing like the booming authority Clint had encountered in the courtroom. "I don't know who else. Who else is involved? I swear I didn't know it would go this far." Clint felt a flicker of doubt rise within him, but he suppressed it. The judge's confession, while genuine in its tone, didn't feel like the full truth. There was something more here, something McAllister was still hiding. "Then why did you keep going?" Clint pressed, leaning forward, eyes narrowing. "Why risk it all? You had everything: money, power, influence. Why let it all slip through your fingers?" McAllister's face twisted in pain. He wasn't just a man caught in a web of corruption anymore. He was a man who was truly realizing the magnitude of his own downfall. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a heavy, invisible force. "I didn't think it would end like this," McAllister whispered, his voice barely audible. Clint's eyes softened for the briefest moment, the slightest trace of empathy flickering across his face. He'd seen people in this position before, too many times. It wasn't easy to face your own demons, especially when they were this monstrous. But Clint knew better than to show too much sympathy. Not when the stakes were this high. "Tell me everything," Clint said firmly, his gaze unyielding. For what felt like an eternity, McAllister remained silent, his hands trembling at his sides. Clint was about to press again when the judge suddenly spoke, his voice low, almost broken. "There's more. There's a senator, a powerful one. He's the one behind most of it. He's the one who reached out to me first." McAllister's eyes darted nervously, as if making sure no one was listening. "He's been working with the syndicates, and he's not alone. There are others, higher up than anyone you know." Clint's heart raced. This was bigger than he had imagined. The pieces were falling into place, and now McAllister was opening up. He wasn't giving all the details, but it was a start, a fragile, shaky start. And that was all Clint needed. "Who's the senator?" Clint demanded. "Name him." But McAllister shook his head, his lips pressed tight. "I can't. If I do, they'll kill me. My family. They'll kill my family." Clint's jaw tightened. He knew the risks. McAllister had every reason to be afraid, but the time for hiding behind fear was running out. There were lives at stake, and Clint wasn't about to let the judge's cowardice stop him from exposing the truth. "Your family?" Clint's voice was hard, like steel. "What about the lives of everyone those criminals are destroying? What about the people who will suffer because you didn't do what was right?" McAllister flinched, his face pale. The guilt, the horror of what he'd been a part of, was written all over him. Clint could see that the judge had reached his breaking point. He had been a cog in the machine for too long, and now the machine was grinding to a halt. I don't know if I can help you," McAllister whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "They'll come for me. And they'll come for you too, Clint. You've crossed a line that can't be undone." Clint's eyes never wavered. He wasn't intimidated. He'd faced worse threats before, ones far more dangerous than anything McAllister could comprehend. "You don't have a choice anymore, Judge," Clint said softly, but the conviction in his voice was like a hammer striking an anvil. "You can either die in this lie, or you can live long enough to see justice done. You don't get to make that decision alone anymore. It's time to come clean." For a long moment, McAllister stood frozen, his face a mask of fear and regret. Clint could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. It was in that moment that Clint understood. This was more than just a mission. It was about saving what was left of the system and maybe, just maybe, saving the judge's soul too. Finally, with a slow, reluctant breath, McAllister's shoulders slumped. He seemed to shrink in front of Clint, as though the enormity of the situation had finally crushed him. "I'll tell you everything," he whispered. Clint nodded, his expression hardening again. He had the judge right where he needed him. It was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, but Clint knew this was only the beginning. There were still powerful people out there, hidden in the shadows, and they weren't going to let McAllister go down without a fight. But for now, Clint had a lead. And as always, he would use it. He would follow it to the end. As McAllister began to talk, revealing names and connections Clint had never imagined, Clint's thoughts flickered briefly to the path that had led him here. He had started this investigation because of a promise to expose the truth, no matter what. And now, as the storm gathered around him, Clint knew he was about to step into the heart of it. The truth was coming, but so was the fallout. And Clint Eastwood was ready for whatever came next. The weight of McAllister's revelations settled over Clint like a heavy blanket. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place faster than he had anticipated. And with each new name and connection that the judge provided, Clint could feel the magnitude of the operation they were up against. The senator, the international crime syndicates, the money laundering. It was a web so tangled, it seemed impossible to unravel. But Clint had always been a man who thrived in chaos. He could see the path forward, even if the journey was going to be treacherous. The next few days passed in a blur. Clint and his team worked tirelessly, following every lead, piecing together the network of corruption that stretched from Washington, D.C. to far-flung corners of the world. With McAllister's help, they were able to track down several key players in the conspiracy, including the senator who had been the mastermind behind it all. The man, a high-ranking official in the government, had been pulling the strings from the shadows for years. It was a chilling realization, but Clint didn't hesitate. The mission had to be completed. Clint had always known that exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. It never was. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. The senator's allies were powerful, ruthless individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Clint knew they would be coming for him soon, and he had no illusions about what that meant. But it didn't matter. The stakes were too high, and Clint had come too far to back down now. As Clint sat in the safe house late one evening, reviewing the final pieces of evidence they had gathered, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought him to this point. The people he had encountered, the risks he had taken. It all seemed to come full circle now. He had started out just a man with a mission, a man determined to bring justice to a broken system. But somewhere along the way, it had become more than that. It had become a fight for the very soul of the country he had sworn to protect. Sarah entered the room, her face drawn with fatigue but determined as ever. "We've got them," she said, her voice steady. "The senator's been tied to several accounts offshore. We're about to blow the lid off this whole thing." Clint looked up at her, his gaze hard but appreciative. "This isn't over, Sarah. They're going to come after us. You know that, right?" She nodded. "I know. But we're close, Clint. We've got enough to bring him down. It's just a matter of getting it into the right hands." Clint stood up, his mind racing. "We can't afford any mistakes. We need to move fast before they can cover their tracks. If we wait too long—" "I know," Sarah interrupted. "We won't wait. We've got everything we need. We can end this." Clint's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon holstered at his side. Sarah, too, tensed up, ready for whatever might come through the door. But it wasn't an enemy. It was Thomas, a grim expression on his face. "It's time," he said simply, a slight quiver in his voice. Clint's stomach tightened. He knew what that meant. This was it, the final push, the moment that would either make or break everything they had worked for. The team quickly gathered their things, preparing for the final confrontation. Clint could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins as they piled into their cars, heading toward the senator's estate, where the final showdown was about to take place. There would be no turning back now. As they approached the mansion, Clint's mind raced through all the possible outcomes. This had to be done by the book. There could be no missteps. One wrong move, and everything they had worked for would be lost. They had the evidence, they had the leads, and they had the element of surprise. But Clint knew better than anyone that nothing was guaranteed. The mansion loomed ahead, its imposing gates standing tall in the moonlight. The security detail surrounding the place was tight. Clint had anticipated as much, but he was ready. With the right coordination, they could take the senator down without a hitch. Clint and his team split up, each moving into position. The sound of their footsteps was muted on the gravel, their movements deliberate and precise. Clint's eyes were locked on the front doors of the mansion, his heart pounding in his chest. It was time. As Clint approached the doors, he could feel the weight of what was about to happen. He wasn't just about to bring down a corrupt politician. He was about to change the course of everything. The senator, and everyone connected to him, had to be stopped. The entire network had to be exposed. The truth had to come to light. Clint signaled to his team, and with a swift motion, they breached the doors. The surprise was total. The senator's security didn't know what hit them. Within moments, Clint and his team had neutralized the threat, and Clint was standing face to face with the man who had orchestrated it all. The senator, now bound and restrained, was glaring at Clint, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You have no idea what you've just started." Clint's expression was cold, unwavering. "This is just the beginning," he said. "You've already lost." As Clint made sure the senator was handed over to the authorities, a wave of relief washed over him. They had done it. They had brought down the conspiracy. The justice that had seemed so out of reach just weeks before was now a reality. But as Clint stood there, watching the senator being escorted away in handcuffs, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't truly over. There would always be another threat lurking in the shadows. There would always be more corruption to root out. But for the first time in a long while, Clint felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth, and in doing so, he had made the world a little bit safer. He turned to his team, his expression softening for the first time in what felt like forever. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse but full of conviction. "This is just the start." As the team gathered around him, a sense of camaraderie and accomplishment filled the air. They had been through hell together, but they had come out the other side victorious. For Clint, it wasn't just about bringing down the corrupt. It was about making sure that the truth, no matter how dark or difficult, was always worth fighting for. The journey had been long and filled with sacrifice, but in the end, the message was clear. The truth would always prevail, and Clint Eastwood had made sure of that. The weeks following the fall of the senator were a whirlwind. News outlets had exploded with coverage of the scandal. Headlines blared about the corruption in the highest offices, the syndicates operating under the noses of the very people who were meant to uphold justice. Clint's face was plastered on TV screens nationwide. His name, once a whisper in the world of law enforcement, had become a symbol of unwavering resolve. For Clint, the attention was both a relief and a burden. He had always been a man of action, not words. But now, the weight of public perception rested on his shoulders. The people who had once doubted him were now looking to him as a hero. It was a role Clint never asked for. He wasn't in it for the praise. He was in it to make sure things changed. Still, change wasn't as simple as catching one bad guy. With the senator out of the picture, there were still countless individuals who had been involved in the web of corruption. Other members of the syndicate remained at large, and Clint knew the road ahead was still fraught with danger. Yet, amidst the chaos, Clint couldn't deny the shift in his own perspective. The weight of his work had never been heavier, but there was a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He had a renewed fire in his gut, not only to finish the job, but to take on whatever new challenges lay ahead. One night, Clint found himself sitting at a bar, the clink of ice in his glass providing the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. He wasn't in the mood for company, but he needed to clear his mind. The recent success, while rewarding, had left him with a gnawing emptiness. He'd spent so much time focused on the mission, on bringing justice, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to just live. As Clint took a sip from his glass, he heard the familiar sound of someone sliding into the seat next to him. It was Sarah. She hadn't said much in the last few days, too focused on making sure everything was running smoothly. But tonight, it seemed, the weight of their shared victory had caught up with her as well. "You good?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but piercing through the quiet hum of the bar. Clint shrugged, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid swirling in his glass. "Yeah, just figuring out what comes next." She smiled slightly. "That's a loaded question. A lot of things changed, but some things haven't. You know that, right?" Clint met her eyes for the first time in a while. "Yeah, I know. There's always more work to do. There's always someone out there pulling the strings." Sarah took a sip from her own drink, her expression thoughtful. "You think the senator's downfall is enough to fix it all?" Clint chuckled, a dry, almost bitter sound. "No, but it's a start. The problem runs deeper than just one man. The system's broken, Sarah. You know that better than anyone." She nodded, her face reflecting the same understanding that Clint had carried with him all these years. "We can't fix the whole system overnight, but we can keep doing what we've been doing, one piece at a time." Clint leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't have the answers, but Sarah was right. They couldn't fix everything at once, and maybe that was the best approach. Take it one day, one case at a time. Maybe that was all he needed to do, to stay focused on the next step, not the final destination. "You've got a way with words," Clint said, a rare grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. She smiled back. "I've learned from the best." The two of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Clint found it hard to admit, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel quite so alone. It had been a long road, and the road ahead would be just as difficult. But maybe, just maybe, the journey wouldn't be as dark as it once had been. As they finished their drinks, Clint stood up, straightening his jacket. All right, let's get back to it. We've got a job to finish. Sarah followed his lead, standing up as well. I thought you'd never ask. They exited the bar together, the cool night air greeting them as they stepped onto the street. Clint looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The mission wasn't over. It never would be. But Clint Eastwood was ready for whatever came next. The following weeks passed in a blur of briefings, paperwork, and late-night strategy sessions. Despite the success in bringing down the senator and his corrupt network, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that something was still amiss. The quiet moments were starting to feel louder, as though something was just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Clint's phone buzzed sharply on his desk, cutting through the silence of his office. He glanced at the screen, seeing Sarah's name flashing across the screen. Clint, we've got a situation. Her voice crackled through the phone. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Go ahead, Clint responded, sitting up straight, instantly alert. There's a new player in town. We've traced financial records tied to someone new. A ghost. They've been cleaning money through the same channels the senator used, but they're too good to be on our radar. Sarah's voice grew more urgent. We need to move fast. They're not like the others. Clint rubbed the back of his neck, his instincts firing. He knew that the senator was just one piece of a larger puzzle. What Sarah was saying wasn't a surprise, but it still hit hard. There was always more, always a deeper level of corruption. Where's the trail leading us? Clint asked, standing up and grabbing his jacket, ready to move. East Coast, New York City. I'm sending you the intel now, Sarah replied. It's a long shot, but we have to check it out. This person is working in the shadows, and I don't think they'll go down as easily as the senator. Clint didn't hesitate. He knew the dangers of waiting too long. I'll head out now. Get the team ready. We're going in. Minutes later, Clint was in the car, racing toward the airport. The rush of adrenaline surged through him as he thought of the challenges that lay ahead. This wasn't just a case. It was a personal mission. The people he'd brought down before had all been pawns in a much larger game. He had no illusions about the depth of the corruption in this country. If there was one thing Clint had learned, it was that the fight against the powerful never ended. The flight was uneventful, and by the time Clint landed in New York, he was already mentally preparing himself for whatever this new mystery entailed. He trusted Sarah's instincts. If she said they were dealing with someone dangerous, then he knew this wouldn't be easy. When Clint stepped out of the airport terminal, the cold winter air of New York City hit him, crisp and sharp. The city never slept, and tonight, it seemed especially alive with possibility and hidden dangers. He didn't have time to get lost in the hustle of the city. There was work to do. He met up with Sarah and the rest of the team at a nondescript safe house in Brooklyn, away from prying eyes. They had a tight schedule. A storm was brewing in the financial underworld, and Clint wasn't about to let it hit without a fight. We've got everything we need, Sarah said, setting down a folder of documents onto the table. This person, whoever they are, has been covering their tracks so well, we can't even find a name. But the transactions are tied to a company called Meridian Group. They've been laundering billions through offshore accounts, and the trail leads back to someone at the highest level. Clint's brow furrowed. Meridian Group. That sounds familiar. Sarah nodded. That's because it's a front. What we don't know yet is who's behind it. Clint sat down and started flipping through the paperwork. There were names, dates, encrypted messages, all leading to dead ends. He could feel the familiar tension building. This wasn't going to be as straightforward as the senator. This person was hiding in plain sight. As the team went over the information, Clint's thoughts turned to the idea of anonymity. The more powerful the person, the harder it became to track them. But they couldn't afford to give up. Not now. He looked over at Sarah, who was deep in thought, her eyes scanning the files. We need more. Someone's been feeding them intel, someone who knows how we work. Sarah's gaze shifted to Clint, a small but knowing expression on her face. You think it's an inside job? I don't know, but it's possible. If we're not careful, they'll see us coming before we even know who they are, Clint replied, his voice low with concern. The conversation continued late into the night, with the team running through every scenario. They could feel the walls closing in, but there were still too many unknowns. As dawn broke over the skyline, Clint was no closer to understanding who the true mastermind was. It was as if they were chasing a shadow, one that was constantly slipping through their fingers. Just as Clint was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed. A single text message lit up the screen. "They know you're coming. They're already 2 steps ahead." Clint's heart raced, but his face remained stoic. He had known this day would come. It was only a matter of time before the people they were up against would try to outsmart them. But Clint was determined to stay 1 step ahead, no matter the cost. He turned to Sarah. "We're being watched. Someone's onto us." She stared at him, her face serious. "I'll get the team on it. We'll keep moving forward. But Clint, be careful. These people play for keeps." Clint nodded, already mentally preparing for the fight that was about to unfold. He wasn't about to let them win, no matter how far they thought they could outmaneuver him. As the team packed up, Clint's thoughts raced. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. They had made a mistake by underestimating him, and now he was going to make sure they paid for it. They wouldn't just get away with this. They would know Clint Eastwood was on their tail, and he wasn't about to let them disappear into the shadows without a fight. The sun barely poked through the foggy skyline of New York, casting a dull light across the city. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The message he received just hours earlier had sent a chill down his spine. Whoever was behind this operation was methodical, calculating, and had resources beyond what Clint had imagined. As the team gathered in the safe house, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had originally anticipated. The stakes had been raised, and it was no longer just a matter of following the money. It was about survival. "We've got a lead," Sarah announced, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "Meridian Group's headquarters is a front. We've traced one of the larger money transfers to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It could be a safe house or a storage facility, but we need to move fast. We don't know what we're walking into." Clint nodded, his mind already processing the next steps. This wasn't the first time he had been sent into dangerous territory with little more than a hunch and a trail of breadcrumbs. It was what he did best. But even as confident as he was in his instincts, this felt different. This time, they were up against an opponent who knew how to hide in plain sight. "We go in at dusk," Clint said, his voice steady but with a sharp edge that told everyone he was prepared for anything. "We take as few people as possible. Keep it quiet. We don't need to alert anyone that we're onto them." The team nodded, each member understanding the gravity of the situation. It was time to get to work. The drive to the warehouse was uneventful, but Clint couldn't shake the sense of urgency building inside him. Every turn felt deliberate. Every car that passed seemed like a potential threat. He couldn't afford to miss a single detail. His eyes scanned the streets, always alert, always waiting for something, or someone, to stand out. As they approached the warehouse, Clint signaled for the team to stop a few blocks away. They needed to move in slowly, as silently as possible. If they rushed this, they'd alert their target. And if there was one thing Clint had learned in his career, it was that rushing never worked in their favor. They disembarked and approached the warehouse on foot, moving through the shadows like ghosts. The place was quiet, eerily so. The faint hum of the city was the only sound that accompanied them as they crept toward the large metal doors. Clint signaled for the team to halt, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area. "Nothing unusual," Sarah whispered, "but there's definitely activity inside. I can feel it." Clint nodded. "Stay sharp. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." They reached the back of the warehouse, where a small door was barely cracked open. Clint motioned for Sarah to lead the way. She pushed the door open slowly, revealing a dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. The team followed, every step calculated, every breath held. As they ventured deeper into the building, the smell of oil and metal grew stronger. It was clear that this place was more than just a storage facility. This was a headquarters, one that had been designed to hide in plain sight, with hidden rooms, secure doors, and more secrets than Clint cared to think about. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from a nearby hallway, followed by voices. Clint held up his hand, signaling the team to stop. They crouched low, blending into the darkness, waiting for the figures to pass. It was a tense moment. Clint's heart beat faster, his senses sharp as he listened for any sign of movement. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the voices faded, and the footsteps grew distant. Clint motioned for the team to continue. They reached a set of heavy doors at the end of the hallway, and Clint knew they had arrived. This was it, the heart of the operation. Whatever was going on in here, it was bigger than any of them had anticipated. He pushed the doors open with a quiet creak, revealing a massive room filled with computers, monitors, and high-tech equipment. It looked like a nerve center, but there was something off about it. The room was too clean, too well-maintained. It was as if whoever operated this place didn't want anyone to know just how much power they held. "We're not alone," Clint muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. As if on cue, the lights flickered, and the sound of a door slamming shut echoed from behind them. Clint spun around, his instincts kicking into overdrive. Someone was here, and they weren't alone. This was no coincidence. Out of the shadows emerged a tall figure, his face obscured by the dim lighting. Clint didn't hesitate. He knew this was the moment he had been waiting for, the confrontation with the person behind everything. But something wasn't right. The figure didn't attack. Instead, he stood still, almost as if he were waiting for Clint to make the first move. "I knew you'd come," the figure said, his voice cold and calculated. "But it's too late. You're already too far behind." Clint's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward, revealing a sharp, angular face and cold eyes that seemed to pierce through Clint. "You've been chasing shadows, Clint, and now you've finally found me. But your journey ends here." Clint didn't flinch. He had been in these situations before. He was ready for whatever was coming next. "You think you can stop me?" The man chuckled darkly. "You were never meant to find me. You were never meant to win." Suddenly, Clint's team moved into position, surrounding the man. But he wasn't fazed. In fact, he seemed almost amused. "You don't get it, do you?" the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're playing into my hands. This is just the beginning." Clint narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew the game was already over. "Your so-called victory over the senator? It was just a distraction. The real game is just starting." Before Clint could react, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Clint and his team in stunned silence. They had underestimated their enemy, and now Clint realized they were in a race against time. Clint stood motionless, his eyes locked on the spot where the man had just disappeared into the shadows. The adrenaline from the chase, the tension of the confrontation, and the weight of the words echoed in his mind. The real game is just starting. What did that mean? He snapped back into focus as Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "Clint, we need to move. This place is compromised." Without another word, Clint turned and motioned for the team to follow him. They quickly exited the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The air was thick with a sense of urgency. Whoever was behind this had planned every detail, and it was clear that they were already several steps ahead. Clint's mind raced. This was no longer just a case of tracking down corrupt politicians or shady business deals. The web was deeper, more complicated, and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Whoever had orchestrated this knew how to play the long game, how to manipulate people, situations, and power. Once outside, Clint took a moment to gather himself. The cool night air felt refreshing against his skin, but the weight of the unknown was heavy. The stakes had changed. They weren't just hunting criminals anymore. They were hunting something far more elusive, a network that spanned across the country and possibly beyond. "We need to get back to the safe house," Clint said, his voice steady but full of determination. "We need to figure out what's really going on." Back at the safe house, the team gathered around the conference table, spread out with maps, files, and laptops. Clint paced back and forth as Sarah and the others reviewed the intel they had gathered so far. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were close, too close, maybe. Whoever was behind all of this had to know they were being tracked. But what were they waiting for? What was the endgame? We've got a problem, Sarah said, breaking the silence. The Meridian Group wasn't just laundering money. They've been funneling it into a network of shell companies, all of which are linked to a private intelligence firm, one that's not on any public radar. Clint's brows furrowed. An intelligence firm? What do they want with that kind of money? That's the thing, Sarah replied. It's not about the money anymore. This isn't a regular criminal organization. We're looking at a highly organized group with resources in every sector: business, government, intelligence. Whoever's behind this has their fingers in every pie. Clint stopped pacing and stared at the screen. This was bigger than he thought. Far bigger. And if there was one thing Clint knew, it was that people like this weren't just after money or power. They were after something much darker: control. Do we have a name? Who's behind it? Clint asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We don't have a solid lead, Sarah admitted, but we have a hunch. The financial trail leads to a mysterious figure known only as the Architect. Clint's heart skipped a beat. The Architect? Yes, Sarah confirmed, but we don't know much about them. It's all speculation at this point. What we do know is that the Architect has been behind some of the biggest financial operations we've ever encountered. The kind of things that shake countries and governments to their core. Clint ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This goes beyond just New York. We're talking about an international network, potentially with government-level connections. Exactly, Sarah said. And it's not just about making money. The goal here is bigger than that. The Architect is setting up something that could change the balance of power in this country, and possibly the world. Clint's thoughts raced as he processed the information. If the Architect was pulling the strings, then they were up against someone who didn't just play by the rules. They made their own rules. This was no longer about bringing down corrupt politicians. It was about stopping something far more dangerous before it was too late. We need to move fast, Clint said, his voice filled with urgency. This isn't just about investigating anymore. This is a race against time. If we don't act quickly, we could be looking at a much larger catastrophe. Sarah nodded in agreement. I'll get the team on it. We need to start tracing every lead, every connection. If we can get to the Architect, we can stop this. Clint turned to face the team, his gaze hardening. We're in this together. No matter what happens next, we don't stop until we get to the bottom of this. It's the only way. The next few days were a blur of late nights, late-night calls, and deep dives into the financials. Clint couldn't afford to rest. Every time he thought he was getting closer, another dead end appeared. The deeper they dug into the Meridian Group and the private intelligence firm, the more they realized just how interconnected everything was. The trail had become almost impossible to follow. But then, late one night, they finally got a break. I've found something, Sarah said, her voice sharp with excitement as she entered Clint's office. She handed him a file. This is a list of names. Potential people connected to the Architect. Clint took the file and skimmed through the names. His eyes paused on one particular name, Derek Whitmore. Whitmore, Clint muttered under his breath. I know that name. Sarah nodded. He's a former government contractor with ties to several high-level security agencies. We've tracked some of his financial transactions back to Meridian Group, and now we're seeing his name connected to the Architect. But no one knows where he is right now. Clint's mind raced. If Whitmore was involved, this wasn't just an international conspiracy. It was one that reached into the highest levels of power in the country. We need to find Whitmore, Clint said, a cold edge in his voice. And we need to find him fast. The game was shifting once again. But this time, Clint knew they were getting closer to the truth. And whatever that truth was, it was going to change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. Every time they found a lead, the trail seemed to grow colder. Every door they opened led to more questions with no clear answers. And now, with Derek Whitmore's name on the list, the stakes had become personal. Whitmore wasn't just a figurehead in this operation. He was a key player in something much larger than Clint had ever anticipated. The team had gathered once again, their faces grim as they pored over the information that had begun to pile up. Sarah had done a deep dive into Whitmore's background, uncovering a series of red flags that pointed to his involvement in multiple covert operations, each one more secretive than the last. "I've got a potential lead on Whitmore's location," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "It looks like he's been hiding out in a private estate upstate. We don't have confirmation yet, but I've got a source who's willing to help us track him down." Clint nodded. "Get the team together. We're not waiting any longer. This is our chance." Hours later, they were on the road, heading toward the remote estate where Whitmore had been hiding. The drive was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Clint kept his eyes on the road, his mind constantly shifting between the mission and the growing sense of danger that he could feel closing in around them. As they approached the estate, Clint's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The sprawling mansion sat in the middle of a thick forest, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to swallow the horizon. It was the kind of place where secrets were hidden, where things were done in the shadows. They parked a safe distance away and made their way toward the estate on foot, the cool night air cutting through their clothing. Clint's instincts were on high alert. Every noise, every movement, felt amplified in the silence of the woods. "We need to be careful," Clint whispered, motioning for the team to stay close. "Whitmore won't be alone. He's got the kind of protection that doesn't just come from money. It comes from power. Stay sharp." They moved in slowly, keeping to the cover of the trees. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark windows giving off an ominous glow under the moonlight. Clint could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a manhunt anymore. It was a confrontation with a shadowy figure who had the means to alter the course of history. As they neared the entrance, Clint signaled for the team to halt. They had reached a set of tall gates that led into the estate. Clint knew that if they were going to make it inside without alerting Whitmore's security, they'd need to move fast. "Sarah, you take the east side," Clint ordered. "Mike, you cover the west. I'll go straight through the front. We meet at the main door." The team nodded, and without another word, they split up, moving with a precision that Clint had come to rely on. The night was eerily still, the only sounds coming from their footsteps as they made their way to their positions. Clint reached the front door first, crouching low behind a bush. His eyes scanned the estate, looking for any signs of movement. It was silent, too silent. Something didn't feel right. "Clint, we've got a problem," Sarah's voice crackled through the comms. "There's a lot more security here than we thought. They've got guards patrolling the perimeter. We can't just walk in." Clint gritted his teeth, the tension mounting in his chest. They had anticipated some level of security, but not this much. "We'll have to improvise. Keep a low profile and move when the coast is clear. We need to get inside before they lock everything down." As they continued to survey the area, Clint's mind raced. Whitmore wasn't just hiding. He was preparing for something. Clint could feel it in his gut. There was something about this estate that felt like a final stand, a place where secrets were buried and only the powerful knew the truth. Clint waited for the signal, watching the guards as they made their rounds. They were armed, alert, and clearly ready for trouble. Clint knew that they couldn't afford to make a mistake. A few minutes later, Sarah's voice came through again, more urgent this time. "Clint, I think they're on to us. We've got company." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He could hear the faint sound of engines in the distance, several vehicles heading in their direction. "Get to the house now," Clint ordered, adrenaline flooding his veins. "We can't afford to wait any longer." The team moved swiftly, darting between trees and staying out of sight. Clint's thoughts raced as they approached the mansion. Whitmore had anticipated them. He had known they were coming, and now they were walking into a trap. They reached the main door, and Clint signaled for Sarah to break the lock. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the tension mounting around them. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside, the heavy silence of the mansion swallowing them whole. Once inside, Clint's senses heightened. The place was vast, its grand hallways lined with dark wood and expensive art. But there was no time to appreciate the luxury. They needed to find Whitmore, and fast. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Clint motioned for the team to stay down, his eyes scanning the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just above them. Clint's heart pounded in his chest. They weren't alone. "Stay alert," Clint whispered, drawing his weapon. "We don't know how many people are here." They moved cautiously, heading toward the staircase that led to the second floor. The tension was unbearable, every step bringing them closer to the unknown. They were on the brink of something big, and Clint could feel the weight of what was to come. As they reached the top of the stairs, a door creaked open. Clint's hand shot out, signaling for them to stop. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut, and a cold, familiar voice echoed from behind it. "I've been expecting you." Clint's pulse quickened. They had found him. But the real question was, would they be able to survive what came next? The voice echoed through the hallway, chilling Clint to the bone. It wasn't just a greeting. It was a declaration, a confirmation of what he feared most. The architect, the man who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, the one who had orchestrated every move in this game of power and manipulation. He was closer than Clint had ever imagined. "Clint Eastwood," the voice continued, smooth and mocking. "I knew you'd come. You've been quite the thorn in my side, haven't you?" Clint's hand gripped his weapon tighter. He signaled for the team to stay back, then took a slow step forward. Every instinct told him that walking into that room could be the end. But he had no choice. The architect had been too elusive for too long. He had to confront him, no matter the cost. "Show yourself," Clint called out, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "We're not here to play games." There was a pause, and then the door opened, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. Tall, composed, and impeccably dressed, the man's features were sharp and calculated. But it was his eyes, cold, calculating, and filled with knowledge, that unsettled Clint the most. "Well, the man said, stepping forward into the dim light. "I must admit, I expected you to be a bit more formidable in person." Clint's heart rate quickened. The architect, Derek Whitmore, stood before him, but it was hard to reconcile the man before him with the shadowy figure he had been chasing for months. Whitmore wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was the embodiment of the very system Clint had spent his life trying to dismantle. "We've been looking for you," Clint said, his voice barely a whisper but laced with steel. "And now we've found you." Whitmore's lips curled into a smile. "Oh, I know you have. But it's far too late, Clint. You think you've been chasing me? No. You've been chasing shadows. And I am the one who controls the darkness." Clint's mind raced, trying to make sense of what Whitmore was saying. This was a man who had been untouchable, pulling strings behind the scenes, but now here he was, face to face. Still, Clint knew better than to underestimate him. He had survived too many battles to fall for such arrogance. "Who are you really?" Clint demanded, his tone shifting. "What's the endgame here? All this power, all this manipulation, what's it for?" Whitmore's smile widened, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Endgame? That's such a quaint term, Clint. But you're missing the bigger picture. The world is changing. Everything you thought you knew about power, about control, is obsolete. I'm not just playing the game. I'm rewriting it." Clint's gaze narrowed. "And the Meridian Group? The private intelligence firm? What's your connection to all of this?" Whitmore shrugged, his demeanor calm and almost nonchalant. The Meridian Group was just the beginning. They were a means to an end, a way to fund a much larger operation. But the real power lies in information, Clint. The world is run on secrets, and I know them all. The words hit Clint like a punch to the gut. Information. It all came down to control. The information Whitmore had gathered over the years, the power he held through his network, was what had made him untouchable. And now, he was on the verge of reshaping the very fabric of the world. "You're playing with fire," Clint warned, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You think you can control all of this? You think you can just reshape the world to fit your vision?" Whitmore laughed, the sound cold and devoid of warmth. "Control, Clint? It's not about control. It's about evolution. You see, I don't need to control the world. I need to shape it into something more efficient, something that works for the few, not the many. You can't change the system. It's too ingrained, too powerful. But I can destroy it and rebuild something better, something unbreakable." Clint felt a chill run down his spine. Whitmore's words were dangerous, not just in their content, but in their conviction. This was a man who believed in his own ideology to the point of madness, a man who thought he could change the world by tearing it apart and remaking it in his image. "I won't let you do that," Clint said, his voice steady but resolute. "We'll stop you. You won't get away with it." Whitmore's expression softened, as if Clint's defiance amused him. "You think you have the power to stop me? You and your team? You're nothing but pawns in a game that's already been won." Clint's eyes narrowed. "It's not over yet, Whitmore. We're just getting started." The architect's face darkened, and the air in the room shifted. For the first time, Clint sensed a flicker of anger beneath Whitmore's calm exterior. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Whitmore spat. "You have no idea what you're up against. You'll never be able to stop what's already been set in motion." Before Clint could respond, a sudden crash interrupted their conversation. The door to the room flew open, and several armed guards stormed in, weapons drawn. Clint's instincts kicked in, and he immediately reached for his sidearm, ready for a fight. But Whitmore raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. "No need for that," Whitmore said, his tone almost bored. "Let them be, for now." Clint's mind raced. This was a trap. He could feel it. Whitmore wasn't concerned about the immediate danger. He was playing a bigger game, and Clint was just a small part of it. "We're done here," Clint said, turning toward the door. "We'll stop you. You're not invincible." Whitmore's smirk never wavered. "We'll see, Clint. We'll see." Clint knew that this confrontation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And whatever Whitmore had planned next, Clint and his team would need to be ready. Because if they didn't stop him now, the world would never be the same. As they retreated from the mansion, Clint couldn't shake the weight of Whitmore's words. The game is already won. What did that mean for them? What did that mean for the future? He turned to Sarah, his face grim. "We have to move fast. We don't know how much time we have." She nodded. "We'll find a way. But we need to dig deeper. Whitmore is playing a much bigger game than we realize." Clint looked out into the night, the looming darkness surrounding them. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a battle for the very future of the world. And Clint was prepared to do whatever it took to win. The drive back to their safe house was silent, each member of the team lost in their own thoughts. Clint sat in the front seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, though his mind was far from the immediate surroundings. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Whitmore, how calm, collected, and terrifyingly confident the man had been. Clint had seen his share of criminals, and he knew that Whitmore wasn't like the others. He wasn't a man who could simply be arrested and locked away. The worst part of it all? Whitmore's words lingered in Clint's mind like an unsettling echo. The game is already won. What did that mean? Was it just the ramblings of a man who thought too highly of himself? Or was there something deeper at play? "Clint," Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. He turned toward her, her face as serious as ever. "I think we need to take a different approach. We've been looking at this from the wrong angle. Whitmore isn't just one piece of the puzzle. He's the center." Clint nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Whitmore wasn't just orchestrating a few illegal deals. He was behind everything. He had eyes and ears everywhere, pulling strings and shaping events on a global scale. "I'm listening," Clint said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "What do you suggest?" Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers tapping against the tablet in her lap. "We need to go deeper, much deeper than we've gone before. Whitmore has a network that spans across continents, but it's all tied to something bigger than just him. We're missing the core of it all. We need to find out who else is involved. We need to connect the dots from the top down." Clint's mind raced. Whitmore wasn't acting alone. There were people behind him, people who were just as dangerous, just as powerful. And if they could get to the heart of it, they could finally put an end to this twisted game. "I'll talk to the agency," Clint said. "We need more intel, and we need it now." By the time they arrived at the safe house, the weight of the mission had settled back into Clint's shoulders like an anchor. He pulled his coat tighter around him as they entered the building, and he immediately went to work, contacting his contacts within the government. He had a few people who owed him favors, people who would be able to provide him with the information he needed to move forward. But as the night wore on, Clint couldn't shake the sense of urgency gnawing at him. Whitmore was still one step ahead. Clint could feel it. The man was always 2 steps ahead, and Clint was running out of time. It wasn't long before Clint's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but instinct told him to pick up. "Clint," a voice said on the other end, smooth and almost too calm. "I think we have a mutual interest in seeing Whitmore brought to justice." Clint's blood ran cold. There was something about the voice that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He was dealing with someone who knew just as much as Whitmore, maybe more. "Who is this?" Clint demanded. "I'm someone who knows what's really going on. But if you want answers, you'll have to meet me. I have information that will change everything for you." Clint hesitated, his mind working quickly. "Where?" A pause. "I'll send you the coordinates. But be careful. Whitmore's not the only one who has been playing you. There are others involved, others who want to keep everything hidden. You won't be able to trust anyone." The line went dead before Clint could respond. His eyes met Sarah's across the room. She could see the look in his eyes, the same look he had whenever something didn't sit right with him. "Who was it?" Sarah asked. "Someone who claims to know everything. Someone who says they can help us take Whitmore down," Clint replied, his voice low. "But we don't know if we can trust them." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "We don't have much of a choice. If there's even a chance this person has the answers we need, we have to take it." Clint hesitated for a moment, weighing the risk. But Sarah was right. This could be their breakthrough, or it could be a trap. But either way, they had to follow the lead. "We leave in an hour," Clint said, turning back to his phone to check the coordinates. The location they were given led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was dark, dilapidated, and isolated, perfect for a meeting that would most likely end in danger. Clint signaled to his team to stay alert as they approached the entrance. "Stay low," Clint whispered. "We don't know who we're dealing with here." They made their way through the narrow alley, the shadows of the building creeping over them. Clint's heart pounded in his chest, the anticipation building as they neared the warehouse doors. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this was a setup, but he couldn't afford to back down now. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, empty interior. Clint scanned the room, his hand on his weapon, but there was no movement, no sound. It was as if they were walking into the heart of a ghost town. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted someone, a figure standing near the back of the warehouse. A man. The figure stepped forward, the dim light casting long shadows over his face, but Clint could make out enough to see that he wasn't a threat. "Yet, you made it," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Good. I was starting to wonder if you were going to show up." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "I'm someone who knows what Whitmore is really up to, and I've got the evidence to prove it." Clint's mind raced. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment that could expose everything. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. Was this really the ally he needed, or had they just walked into another trap? "Show me," Clint demanded. The man stepped closer, holding out a small envelope. Clint took it cautiously, but before he could open it, the man's expression turned serious. "But you need to understand something. Whitmore is just a small part of this. There are people at the top, Clint. People with far more power, more influence than you can imagine. And they won't stop until they've destroyed everything you care about." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He'd always known that Whitmore wasn't working alone. But this was bigger than anything he could have imagined. The man turned to leave, but Clint grabbed his arm. "Who else is involved?" The man paused and turned back with a grim look. "I wish I could tell you, but some secrets are too dangerous to share." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Clint with more questions than answers. Clint stood there in silence, staring at the envelope in his hand. His mind raced, trying to piece together the new information. Whitmore was a pawn in a much larger game. The real battle was only just beginning. And now, Clint was faced with the harsh reality. There were forces at play that were far more dangerous than he ever realized. The silence in the warehouse was deafening as Clint stood frozen in place, the envelope still clenched tightly in his hand. The man who had given him the cryptic warning was already gone, vanishing into the shadows like a specter. Clint's thoughts spun wildly. He couldn't shake the weight of the man's words. There are people at the top, Clint. People with far more power, more influence than you can imagine. The idea that Whitmore was just a small part of something bigger, a system of hidden players with unimaginable power, had shaken him to his core. For the first time, Clint felt truly out of his depth. He'd dealt with dangerous criminals before, but this was different. Whoever these people were, they weren't just interested in money or influence. They were interested in reshaping the world itself. Clint, Sarah's voice broke through his reverie. She stepped cautiously toward him, her face a mask of concern. You all right? Clint didn't immediately respond. His mind was still processing the conversation and the ominous message left behind by the stranger. He knew that time was running out. They were being drawn into a game that was far more complex than they had anticipated. He turned to Sarah, his voice grim. I don't know what we're dealing with anymore. Whitmore's just the tip of the iceberg. There's something much larger at play. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. I figured as much. But what's our next move? Clint hesitated, then tore open the envelope, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. Inside was a set of coordinates, different from the ones they had followed to the warehouse. A new lead, but it was the handwritten note on the back that caught his attention. Meet me at the old pier. Midnight. Come alone if you want answers. You're not the only one hunting them. Clint's eyes narrowed as he read the note. This was it. Another clue. Another breadcrumb in a trail that was leading them deeper into a conspiracy that seemed to span continents. He turned to Sarah. We're going to the pier, Clint said decisively. But we need to be careful. I don't trust anyone right now, and I sure as hell don't trust that note. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I'll be with you every step of the way. The old pier was an eerie place, abandoned and forgotten by most of the city. The faint sound of waves crashing against the docks echoed in the distance, but other than that, the place felt entirely still, unnaturally still. The dim lights from the street lamps cast long shadows across the wooden planks, creating an atmosphere of foreboding. Clint, Sarah, and the rest of the team moved cautiously, their footsteps silent as they made their way toward the end of the pier. Clint kept his hand on his weapon, ready for anything. Stay sharp, Clint whispered to the team. This doesn't feel right. They reached the end of the pier and waited. Time seemed to stretch on forever as they stood there, the cold air biting at their skin. Clint kept his eyes scanning the horizon, every instinct on high alert. He didn't know who they were meeting, but he wasn't taking any chances. If Whitmore and his network of hidden players had eyes everywhere, then they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Clint, Sarah whispered, her voice tense. Someone's coming. A figure slowly emerged from the shadows, moving toward them with deliberate steps. Clint's eyes locked on the figure, and his muscles tensed in response. The man was tall, cloaked in a dark coat, his face obscured by the collar. But Clint could feel the weight of his presence. This wasn't just any informant. This was someone who knew exactly how deep the rabbit hole went. The man stopped a few feet away from Clint, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. Clint Eastwood, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. I was wondering how long it would take you to show up. Clint's eyes narrowed. Who are you? The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the team as if he were taking stock of who they were. I'm the person who can help you, the man said finally, and I can give you the answers you need about Whitmore and the people behind him. Clint's jaw tightened. You've got 5 minutes. Start talking. The man chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. Impatient. I like that. But this is bigger than Whitmore. He's just a tool, a puppet. The real players are far more dangerous than you realize. Clint's stomach churned. The real players. The words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that whatever they had uncovered so far was only a fraction of the truth. Go on, Clint urged, his voice tight with growing frustration. The man leaned in closer, his eyes flicking to the shadows as if ensuring they weren't being watched. I'm not sure if you're ready for the full picture, but here it is. Whitmore's operation is just one piece of a much larger plan. A plan that stretches across governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies. These people, this group they're part of, has been controlling everything from behind the scenes for decades. They have their hands in every major industry, every political event. They've shaped the world as you know it, and they've made damn sure no one finds out. Clint's mind raced. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a conspiracy of global proportions, and they had barely scratched the surface. He forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to get overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. Who are these people? Clint asked, trying to steady his voice. The man hesitated, then looked around once more before responding. They call themselves the Collective. They have one goal: total control. Control over everything: economies, politics, even people's thoughts. They're everywhere, Clint. And Whitmore? He's just one of their operatives. A chill ran down Clint's spine. The Collective, a name that struck fear into his heart. He had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing it confirmed hit him harder than he expected. They've got eyes everywhere, Clint muttered, his mind whirling. How do we stop them? The man's face grew darker. You can't. Not unless you're willing to go up against the most powerful people in the world. But if you're serious about taking them down, you need to follow the money. They've been using it to fund wars, to manipulate elections, to control entire populations. Clint's hand clenched into a fist. This was the fight of his life, the kind of fight that could change the course of history. But the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. How do I get to them? Clint demanded, his voice fierce with determination. The man looked Clint in the eye, his expression grave. You can't do it alone. You'll need allies. People who are willing to risk everything. And even then, it won't be enough. But it's a start. I've sent you everything you need to know. It's up to you to figure out the rest. Before Clint could ask another question, the man turned and melted back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. Clint stood there for a moment, trying to process everything the man had said. The Collective, a shadowy group with its hands in everything. And they were pulling the strings of a broken world. It was clear now. This was no longer just about stopping Whitmore. This was about exposing a system that had been controlling the world for far too long. And Clint Eastwood wasn't going to stop until it was brought to light. The cold air at the pier bit through Clint's jacket, the weight of the revelation sinking in with every passing second. The Collective, a shadow organization so deeply embedded in global affairs that it controlled everything from politics to economies. It felt like they had stepped into a new dimension of danger, one far beyond anything Clint had dealt with before. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal. This was about unraveling a web that could bring down the very fabric of the world order. His team gathered around him, their expressions as grim as his. Clint glanced at Sarah, who was holding up a tablet with the information they'd just received. She scanned it quickly, then met his eyes. "I've found something," she said, her voice low. "There's a bank in Switzerland, one that seems to be acting as a hub for the Collective's transactions. It's off the grid, but there's a pattern of movements we can trace. It's our best shot at finding out who's funding all this." Clint thought for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the metal railing of the pier. He could feel the weight of the decision ahead of him. They could follow this lead, but it wasn't going to be easy. The moment they stepped into the heart of the Collective's operations, there would be no turning back. "What's the plan?" Clint asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. "We'll need to get to Switzerland and access the data. It's going to be risky. We'll be dealing with people who have a vested interest in keeping this quiet," Sarah said, eyes flicking nervously over the information she was reading. "But if we can crack it, we'll have proof. We'll have something that can take down their entire financial network." Clint nodded. "All right, we leave tonight." The team's movements were swift. By the time they reached their safe house, they had packed their gear, gathered intelligence, and made arrangements for their flight to Switzerland. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Clint couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just a mission. It was a gamble. The next day, they landed in Zurich. The air was crisp and cold, and the streets were bathed in a soft winter light. The city was quiet, but Clint knew that quiet could be deceiving. Underneath it all, there was a storm brewing, and they were about to be at the heart of it. "We're close," Clint said, glancing at the coordinates Sarah had pulled from their intel. The Swiss bank was just a few miles away, nestled in the heart of the city's financial district. He could feel the tension in the air. It was almost as if the entire city knew something was about to break. The team moved carefully through the city, staying low, blending into the crowd. They made their way to the bank, a sleek, modern building that contrasted sharply with the older architecture surrounding it. Clint could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on them. This was the moment that could change everything. They approached the building, slipping into a narrow alley behind it. Clint signaled to the team to take their positions. There were guards, and Clint knew they'd need to get past them to reach the vaults where the financial data was stored. Sarah, always the tech expert, had already hacked into the security systems. A few clicks of her keyboard, and the surveillance cameras were offline. It was a risky move, but they had no choice. They had to move fast. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile and cold, the kind of place that felt too perfect to be real. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound as they moved down a narrow corridor, heading toward the vaults. Clint kept a sharp eye on every corner, every movement. The danger was tangible now, every step taking them deeper into enemy territory. As they reached the door to the vault, Clint felt his pulse quicken. This was it. Everything they needed to expose the collective was locked behind those doors. But as Sarah began to work her magic, hacking the security codes to open it, Clint's mind raced. What would they find inside? Would they be able to get the information out before anyone noticed they were there? The door slid open with a quiet whoosh, and Clint motioned for the team to move in. The vault was massive, rows upon rows of servers stacked high, all humming with the pulse of data. It was a treasure trove of secrets, and Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Sarah worked quickly, connecting her laptop to the nearest terminal. "I'm in," she said, her voice tense but focused. "It's going to take a few minutes to pull everything we need, but it's here. It's all here." Clint watched the door, his senses heightened. They were exposed now. Too many things could go wrong. They had to move fast, and they had to get out before anyone realized they were there. And then, just as they thought they were in the clear, the worst possible thing happened. The door slammed open with a loud crash, and Clint spun around just in time to see a group of armed guards storming into the vault. "Get down," Clint shouted, pulling Sarah out of the way just as a bullet whizzed past his head. The team scrambled to take cover behind the massive servers, weapons drawn, ready to defend themselves. Clint's mind raced. They had to escape, but the exit was blocked. Their only hope was to fight their way out, but they were outnumbered, and the element of surprise was gone. "Move now," Clint barked, and the team sprang into action. The gunfire was deafening, ricocheting off the walls as Clint and his team ducked, returning fire whenever they had an opening. Sarah's voice came through his earpiece, breathless. "I've got the data. I'm sending it now. Just get us out of here." Clint didn't need to say anything else. They had the information, and that was all that mattered. Now they just needed to survive long enough to get out. They fought their way through the building, taking down guards one by one, each moment feeling like it could be their last. The stakes had never been higher. They were fighting for the truth, for the chance to expose the collective, but they were also fighting for their lives. As they neared the exit, Clint could hear the distant sound of sirens wailing. The entire building was about to be locked down, and they had no time to waste. "Go!" Clint shouted, pushing the team ahead. They bolted through the hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the sterile silence of the bank. They reached the back door, and Clint swung it open to reveal the night sky. Their getaway car was waiting for them, but it wasn't going to be easy to get to it. The guards were closing in fast, and Clint knew they couldn't outrun them on foot. But luck was on their side. As they made their way toward the car, a hail of bullets rang out, hitting the ground around them. Clint and the team dove into the car just as the doors slammed shut. "Go! Go!" Clint yelled to the driver. The car lurched forward, speeding away from the bank at breakneck speed. As the city lights of Zurich blurred past them, Clint leaned back in his seat, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had the data. They had the proof. But now, they were just beginning to realize the true magnitude of what they had uncovered. The collective was everywhere. And taking them down? That was going to take more than just a few good men. It was going to take a revolution, and Clint Eastwood was ready to lead it. The car sped through the darkened streets of Zurich, the roar of the engine the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Clint's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, strategy, danger, and the crushing weight of the information they'd just uncovered. The data Sarah had retrieved from the bank was the key to exposing the collective, but Clint knew that with it came even greater risks. The city was in chaos. Sirens echoed through the streets, the flashing lights painting the darkness with streaks of red and blue. Clint kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that they were being followed. He could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of being hunted. But as they neared their safe house, Clint allowed himself to breathe a little easier. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the war was far from over. The collective was a global force, and now they had their hands on the very thing that could bring them down. "We need to lay low for a while," Clint said, breaking the silence. He turned to Sarah, who was still engrossed in her tablet, eyes scanning the data they'd stolen. "What did we get?" Sarah didn't look up. "It's worse than we thought, Clint. The transactions are all linked to shell companies, but they trace back to some of the biggest names in the world. Governments, corporations. This isn't just about power anymore. It's about controlling everything." Clint's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. The collective wasn't just a criminal syndicate. It was an empire, a network of power players who had embedded themselves into the very fabric of society. And now, Clint and his team were up against them. "We can't take them down with just this," Clint said. "We need more. We need to expose them for who they really are, get the world to see what they've been doing." "That's the plan," Sarah said, looking up for the first time. "But we need help. The people who are in charge of this operation are untouchable, unless we have the right leverage." Clint thought about it for a moment. He knew she was right. They couldn't go up against the collective alone. They needed to bring in allies, people who had the same stake in bringing this organization down. But who could they trust? Everyone they had met so far had been hiding something, playing their own game. "We'll need to go back to the U.S., Clint said finally, his voice resolute. "We need to bring in someone with access, someone who can move within the circles where the collective operates." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And who do you have in mind?" Clint leaned back in his seat, his mind already moving ahead. He knew exactly who to contact. An old ally, someone who had connections in high places and a reputation for getting things done without asking too many questions. It was risky, but Clint didn't see another option. "We'll need to reach out to Marcus Shaw," Clint said. "He's a former agent with the U.S. Secret Service. He knows how to operate in the shadows. If anyone can help us infiltrate the collective, it's him." Hours later, Clint stood in a small, dimly lit office in downtown Zurich. It was their temporary base of operations while they formulated their next move. The team had scattered to their respective tasks, all working to get a better understanding of what they were up against. Clint was on the phone, speaking with Marcus Shaw. The former agent's voice crackled through the receiver, and Clint could tell from the tone that Marcus had been expecting his call. "Clint," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "I heard you were in trouble, and I heard it's bigger than anything we've dealt with before." Clint didn't mince words. "It is. I need your help, Marcus. We've uncovered something massive. The collective. A shadow organization with more power than we can imagine. They've been running things from behind the scenes for years, and now they're closer to being exposed than ever before." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Marcus responded. "You're not the only one looking for them, Clint. I've been tracking their movements for months. They've infiltrated every aspect of the system, but we've never had enough to take them down." Clint's grip tightened on the phone. "We've got something now. Hard evidence. Financial transactions, links to high-ranking officials. It's all here. But we need your help to get it out in the open. We need to take them down, Marcus. For good." Another pause. Clint could feel Marcus's mind turning the information over. He was no stranger to the world Clint was now navigating, but this was a new level of danger. "All right," Marcus said finally. "I'll help you. But we're going to need more than just this data. We need people on the inside. We need to get their top players to turn on each other." Clint's thoughts raced. Marcus was right. They couldn't expose the collective without dismantling the core of its operation. They would need inside men, people who had been close enough to see the truth but were too afraid or compromised to speak out. Any ideas where we start? Clint asked. I've got a few, Marcus said, but it's not going to be easy. We'll need to move fast. You're going to have to trust me, Clint. We've got a lot to lose if we don't do this right. Clint nodded, though Marcus couldn't see it. I trust you. Let's get it done. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Marcus worked quickly, pulling strings and calling in favors from old contacts. The team moved with precision, making sure every detail was covered. They had one shot at this, and they couldn't afford to fail. But Clint knew that failure was a very real possibility. The collective wasn't just an enemy they could fight with brute force. It was an enemy built on lies, on manipulation, on secrecy. They had to outsmart it. They had to expose it in a way that left no room for doubt. As the day of their next move approached, Clint gathered his team in their safe house. The weight of their mission hung heavy in the air, and Clint could feel the tension building. Everyone knew what was at stake. This is it, Clint said, his voice cutting through the silence. We go in, get the information, and get out. No mistakes. We're not just fighting for our lives anymore. We're fighting for the future of everything we know. The team nodded, their faces a mix of determination and fear. There was no turning back. The storm was coming, and they were going to have to ride it out, no matter what. As they prepared for the next phase of their mission, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the heart of darkness. But he had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. The world was about to learn the truth, and Clint Eastwood was going to make sure of it. The storm clouds hung heavy in the Zurich sky, as though reflecting the turmoil brewing in Clint's mind. The mission ahead was fraught with risks, and Clint could feel the weight of the task bearing down on him. He had been in high-stakes situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about saving lives or bringing down a crime syndicate. This was about exposing an empire, a system that had operated in the shadows for far too long. The stakes were higher than ever. Clint leaned against the cold window of the safe house, watching the city below. His team was preparing for the next phase of the operation, and Marcus Shaw was working tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure their success. But Clint knew that time was running out. The collective wasn't going to sit idly by while they made their move. They were too powerful, too entrenched in every level of society. They would fight back with everything they had. Clint, Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her standing at the door, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. We've got a problem. Clint straightened up, his instincts kicking in. What's going on? It's Marcus, Sarah said, walking into the room and handing him a tablet. We've been tracking his communications, trying to stay ahead of the game, and we found something troubling. Clint took the tablet, his eyes scanning the screen. There, in black and white, were encrypted messages, ones that didn't make sense at first glance. But with Sarah's expertise, they had managed to crack a few key pieces of the puzzle. There's a leak, Clint muttered under his breath. Marcus is compromised. Sarah nodded. It looks like it. The messages don't match his usual patterns. Someone's playing both sides, and it's putting us all in danger. Clint's jaw clenched. He trusted Marcus. He had to. But the evidence was clear. Someone had infiltrated their operation, and they had to find out who before it was too late. We can't afford to trust anyone right now, Clint said, his voice firm. We need to confront Marcus and figure out what's going on. But we have to be careful. If the collective's involved, they won't hesitate to use him against us. Clint, Sarah, and the rest of the team moved quickly. They couldn't afford to waste any time. Their next step was to meet Marcus in a secure location, away from the prying eyes of the collective's network. But as they drove through the winding streets of Zurich, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Stay alert, Clint said, his voice low. I've got a bad feeling about this. As they approached the meeting point, Clint's suspicions only grew. The location was a small, nondescript cafe tucked in a quiet corner of the city. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but Clint knew better than to trust appearances. They parked a few blocks away, moving in carefully, keeping their distance. They entered the cafe, a modest place with dim lighting and the smell of coffee lingering in the air. Clint scanned the room, looking for any signs of danger. It was nearly empty, save for one figure seated at the far end of the room. It was Marcus. Clint approached slowly, his hand resting on the holster at his side. Marcus looked up when he saw Clint, a tight smile on his face. "Clint," Marcus said, his voice neutral, "it's good to see you. You've made it further than I expected." Clint's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. The way Marcus spoke, the calmness in his demeanor. It was all wrong. It didn't feel like the Marcus he knew, the man who had fought alongside him in countless operations. "We need to talk," Clint said, keeping his tone measured. "Something's off. We've been tracking your communications, and there's a leak." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Clint could see a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost imperceptible. "I told you, Clint," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been trying to help you, but I can't control everything. You're up against something much bigger than you realize. The collective has their eyes on you, on all of us." Clint didn't buy it. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Something was wrong, and Marcus was hiding it. "You're not telling me everything," Clint said sharply. "What's going on? Who's behind this?" Marcus remained silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the window as if weighing his options. Then, finally, he spoke. "You really want to know, Clint?" Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "You think you've been uncovering the truth? You've been played. This whole thing, it's bigger than you. The collective isn't just some rogue organization. It's a system that's been in place for centuries. And you," Marcus paused, his eyes darkening, "you're walking into a trap." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" "The collective is just the surface. The real power, the real enemy, is something far older, far more powerful than anything you've encountered. They've been controlling everything. You, me, all of us. And now that you've gotten this far, there's no going back. You've already become part of their game." Clint's mind raced. This was not the Marcus he knew. He had to be lying. But what if he wasn't? What if everything they had believed was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle? Before Clint could respond, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the cafe. His instincts flared. They were no longer alone. Clint's hand shot to his gun, but it was too late. A group of armed men in dark suits stepped into the cafe, surrounding the team. Clint's heart sank. They had been set up. Marcus didn't even flinch as the men closed in. "You should have listened, Clint," he said softly, almost regretfully. "Now you've crossed the line." The men raised their guns, but Clint wasn't about to go down without a fight. His team quickly dove for cover, gunfire erupting in the confined space of the cafe. Clint rolled to the side, his own weapon drawn, returning fire. But the numbers were overwhelming. They were outgunned and outnumbered. "Get out of here," Clint shouted to Sarah, who was still crouched behind a table, her fingers flying over her tablet as she tried to hack into the building's security system. "We need to stop them, Clint," she yelled back. "Go. Now," Clint shouted, his voice harsh as the gunfire intensified. Clint could hear the urgency in Sarah's voice as she reluctantly scrambled toward the back exit. The team needed to escape, but Clint knew that they weren't out of danger yet. The storm had only just begun, and they had no idea what they were truly up against. As the team made their way to the escape route, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's words had struck a chord. The collective wasn't the real enemy. What did that even mean? And if it was true, what kind of force were they really up against? The world was becoming more dangerous with every passing moment, and Clint knew that he had to stay one step ahead. The game had changed. Now, they were in the fight of their lives, and the truth was more elusive than ever. As Clint ducked into the shadows, his eyes narrowing on the city that stretched out before him, he knew one thing for sure. They were no longer hunting shadows. They were hunting a force beyond comprehension. And no matter the cost, Clint was going to bring it down. The cold wind bit through Clint's jacket as he and his team made their way through the dark alleyways of Zurich. Their hearts were still pounding from the ambush at the cafe, but there was no time to dwell on it. Their mission was far from over. In fact, the danger had only grown. The escape through the back exit had been harrowing, but they had managed to slip into the shadows undetected, barely. It was a small victory, but they knew they couldn't keep running forever. The collective had resources, connections, and power that extended far beyond their reach. They needed answers. They needed to uncover the truth. The words Marcus had spoken still haunted Clint's thoughts. The collective isn't the real enemy. What did he mean by that? Who or what was the true power behind it all? And why had Marcus, someone Clint had trusted for years, betrayed them? They were cornered, and the walls were closing in. "We need to move," Clint said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that betrayed the turmoil inside him. "We can't stay here. We need to find a way to get back to the US and regroup. If Marcus is compromised, then we have to find a new way in." "I'm not sure where we stand now," Sarah replied, her voice tense. "If Marcus was working with them, or worse, was already one of them, then everything we've learned could be a trap." Clint's jaw tightened. "It's possible, but we don't have the luxury of sitting back and wondering. We need to act. We need to expose the collective, and we need to do it fast." They reached their safe house, a nondescript building on the edge of the city, and Clint immediately set to work on making contact with their remaining allies. The tension was palpable in the air as everyone scrambled to go over their next move. Sarah had been able to retrieve more intel from the encrypted files she'd gotten from the bank, but nothing concrete yet. They still didn't know the full scope of what they were dealing with. Clint's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. Marcus's warning kept echoing in his ears. The collective wasn't the end of the line. It was just the surface. If that was true, then what lay beneath? What kind of power were they really up against? Hours later, the team sat around a table in the dimly lit room. Maps of Zurich were pinned to the wall, along with photos of individuals who had been tied to the collective's operations. Clint stared at the wall in front of him, tracing the connections with his eyes. The deeper they dug, the more tangled the web became. "We've been going about this all wrong," Clint muttered, running a hand through his hair. He turned to Sarah, who was still glued to her tablet, trying to decrypt the final piece of the puzzle. "We're chasing shadows, and we don't even know who's pulling the strings." "I think I've found something," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes widening in realization. She turned the tablet toward Clint, revealing a series of financial records. At first glance, they looked like any other transaction. But with a closer look, Clint saw something different. "Look at this," Sarah continued, pointing to the screen. "These transactions, they don't just trace back to the people we've already identified. They go much deeper. These accounts, these companies, they're linked to figures we never even considered. High-ranking politicians, tech moguls, global banking elites. The kinds of people we've always seen in the background." Clint's pulse quickened. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, but it opened up even more questions. "You're saying these people are connected to the collective?" Clint asked, his voice low with disbelief. "Not just connected," Sarah replied, her fingers flying over the screen. "These are the people funding it. These are the ones who've been ensuring that the collective operates with complete impunity. The entire structure, it's a pyramid, Clint, and the real power sits at the top." Clint leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the data. His mind raced as he pieced together the implications. The collective wasn't just a criminal syndicate. It was a shadow government, an unseen hand pulling the strings behind every major global event, every crisis, every financial collapse. The true enemy wasn't just a cartel or an organization. It was a network of people with their own agenda who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. "This is bigger than we thought," Clint muttered under his breath. "We need to expose these people. We need to make the world see who they really are." But as he spoke, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that exposing them might not be enough. What if they had already infiltrated every institution, every system? What if these people controlled everything? Before Clint could voice his concerns, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but he quickly stopped himself. It was too deliberate to be a random knock. They were being watched. "Stay sharp," Clint said quietly to the team as he moved toward the door. He glanced through the peephole, and his pulse skipped when he saw who was standing on the other side. It was Marcus. Clint hesitated for a moment, torn between suspicion and the need for answers. He had trusted Marcus once. But could he still? After everything that had happened, it was hard to tell where the line was anymore. "Clint," Marcus called through the door, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable edge. "I need to speak with you. Alone." Clint motioned for the others to stay put as he opened the door. Marcus stepped inside, his face etched with a look that Clint couldn't quite place. He wasn't the same man who had once been his ally. There was something darker in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Clint, I didn't want you to find out this way," Marcus said quietly, his gaze darting around the room, as though to make sure no one was listening. "But you've already walked too far into this to turn back. The truth is, it's more complicated than you think." Clint's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? You've been playing both sides. You're the one who betrayed us, Marcus." Marcus held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I didn't have a choice. None of us did." Clint's jaw tightened. "Then what the hell is going on? Who are you really working for? The collective?" Marcus shook his head, his face a mask of frustration. "No, the collective is just a tool, a weapon. They're being used by something much bigger. Someone I can't even name, Clint. But I'll try to help you understand. You've been hunting the wrong enemy." Clint's blood ran cold. "If you're not working with the collective, then who is the real threat?" Marcus looked Clint dead in the eye, his voice barely a whisper. "You're not ready for that yet. But when you are, I'll be here to help." Before Clint could respond, Marcus turned and walked out of the safe house, leaving Clint standing in the middle of the room, his thoughts swirling with more questions than ever. The real enemy. It was a chilling thought. Clint had always known there were forces at play behind the scenes, but he had never imagined they were this close, this powerful. As the door clicked shut behind Marcus, Clint felt the full weight of the storm bearing down on him. Whatever this real enemy was, it was coming for them. And there was no turning back now. The game had changed again, and Clint had no idea who the next move would come from. The tension in the safe house was palpable as Clint stared at the door Marcus had just exited through. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic message his former ally had left behind. The real enemy. Who was this person or group that had been pulling the strings all along? Who could be more dangerous than the collective, the shadowy organization that had infiltrated governments and corporations around the globe? As Sarah and the others gathered around the table, Clint's gaze drifted from the map of Zurich to the encrypted files Sarah had decrypted. They had uncovered a vast web of corruption, with connections to some of the most powerful figures in the world. But now, with Marcus's warning still fresh in his mind, Clint knew there was more to this story than they had uncovered so far. "We need to figure out what Marcus meant," Clint said, breaking the silence. "Who or what could be controlling the collective from the shadows?" Sarah glanced up from her tablet, her fingers still moving across the screen. "We know that the collective's financial backing comes from high-level players. But Marcus's words suggest there's something bigger at play. Something more sinister." "More sinister?" Clint echoed, his voice heavy. "That's hard to imagine." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Maybe it's not just about power. Maybe it's about control over everything." Clint's stomach churned at the thought. He had always known that power was the ultimate goal for organizations like the collective, but the idea that this went beyond money and influence, beyond political gain, was unsettling. "Okay, so we know the collective is the surface-level threat," Clint continued. "But if Marcus is right, the real enemy is someone, some group, that's been operating in the shadows for far longer. We need to track them down, figure out who they are and what they want." Just as Clint was about to continue, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the text. "The enemy is closer than you think. Don't trust Marcus. Meet me at the old church on Wiesenstrasse. Midnight." Clint's heart skipped a beat. It was an anonymous message, but there was something about it that felt urgent. He looked at Sarah, who was already gathering her things. "This is it," Clint said, his voice steely with determination. "We need to go to that church. It's the lead we've been waiting for." By midnight, the team was gathered outside the abandoned church on Wiesenstrasse. The area was eerily quiet, the streets lit by only the faint glow of the streetlights. Clint's eyes scanned the surroundings, his senses heightened. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. They had no idea who had sent the message or what kind of trap they might be walking into. Clint motioned for the team to spread out, and they silently moved toward the church's entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they pushed them open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The church was old, its stone walls covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, the air thick with the scent of decay. But amidst the silence, Clint felt the presence of someone, or something, waiting for them. "Stay alert," Clint whispered to the others. "We don't know who we're dealing with." The team moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled on the stone floor as they made their way deeper into the church. The atmosphere was suffocating, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of their breathing. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall and dressed in a dark suit, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. He raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. Clint's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he didn't draw it yet. "You're not alone in this," the man's voice echoed through the church, cold and calm. "And you're not the first to come looking." Clint's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you know about Marcus?" The man chuckled softly, his voice a low rumble. "Marcus is just a pawn, like all of you." Clint's eyes narrowed. "You're saying Marcus is working for someone else? Someone higher up?" The man nodded slowly. "Yes, but that's just the beginning. You're playing their game, Clint. You think you're fighting the collective, but you've been following their script all along. They want you to think you're in control, but you're not. No one is." Clint's mind spun. This was it, the breakthrough they'd been looking for. But it raised even more questions than it answered. If Marcus had been a pawn, who were the real players in this game? "You're not making sense," Clint said, his voice growing more urgent. "Who's pulling the strings? Who's the real enemy?" The man stepped forward, his face now partially illuminated by the dim light. Clint could see his features clearly, a sharp jawline, dark eyes that held a dangerous glint. But it wasn't his appearance that struck Clint the most. It was the way he carried himself. This man wasn't just another operative. He was someone who had been in control for a long time. "The real enemy," the man said softly, "is not the collective. They are simply a tool, a means to an end. The true power lies in the hands of those who understand the game and control the pieces." Clint's mind raced as the man's words settled in. The game? What game? And who was the man talking about? The collective? Or something else entirely? "You're saying this goes beyond the collective," Clint said, trying to piece together what the man was saying. "But who controls them?" The man's lips twisted into a dark smile. "Let's just say, the people who control them are the same ones who control the world. Politicians, bankers, military leaders, they've all been bought off. They work for the highest bidder. And when the time comes, they'll betray each other, too." Clint's stomach churned. The scale of this conspiracy was far beyond anything he had imagined. The game wasn't just about money or power. It was about manipulating the entire world. "But why come to me?" Clint asked, his voice low. "Why help me?" The man's eyes glinted with something that resembled amusement. "Because you're a threat to the system, Clint. You've started to uncover the truth. You're digging into something they don't want exposed." Clint's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. "And what do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you," the man said, his voice colder now. "But the question you should be asking is, what do you want? You've already crossed the line. There's no turning back. The game is in motion, and the real enemy is waiting." Before Clint could respond, the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only his cryptic words and the weight of the truth that was slowly unfolding before Clint's eyes. The game had changed yet again. The players were more dangerous than ever, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. What had started as a mission to take down the collective had now become a fight for survival, against forces that had been operating in the shadows for centuries. And Clint knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same. The clock was ticking, and the real enemy was out there, watching their every move. The figure in the shadows disappeared into the darkness of the church, leaving Clint with more questions than answers. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man's words echoed in his mind. The real enemy is not the collective. They are simply a tool. Clint had suspected there was something deeper at play all along. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. Who were these people who controlled the collective? How deep did this conspiracy go? And, most importantly, why had they targeted Clint and his team? The church suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in on him as he tried to process everything. He turned to Sarah, whose face was a mask of uncertainty. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet, almost lost in the silence that enveloped the room. Clint exhaled sharply, his hands clenching into fists. "We go after them. Whoever these people are, whatever game they're playing, we're going to expose them." "But how?" Sarah asked, shaking her head in disbelief. "We've already been exposed to the collective. If this goes deeper, how do we even begin to fight this?" Clint's eyes darkened as he stared into the abyss of the church. "We've been fighting the wrong battle. All this time, we've been focused on taking down the collective, but the real enemy, the people who are controlling everything, they're still out there. And they won't stop until they get what they want." A chill ran down his spine as he realized just how close to the edge they were. They weren't just fighting against a criminal syndicate anymore. They were up against an invisible force that had their fingers in every pie, from politics to business to the military. They had access to every corner of the world, every piece of information, every operation. And Clint and his team were just pawns in their game. "We need to find out who's at the top," Clint muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "We need to know who's pulling the strings." The team spent the next few hours scouring the intel they had gathered over the past few weeks. But no matter how much they dug, they couldn't uncover any new leads. The deeper they went, the more dead ends they encountered. The financial records Sarah had decrypted revealed a network of powerful people, but no one had enough information to link them directly to the real enemy. Every piece of the puzzle was just out of reach. Frustration mounted as the hours passed, and Clint felt the weight of their mission pressing down on him. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. He needed to act now. "Clint," Sarah called, snapping him out of his thoughts. "I think I found something." Clint's eyes shot to the screen, where Sarah was pointing to a set of names that appeared to be linked to the encrypted records they had found. He leaned over her shoulder, scanning the list. "These people," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and excitement, "they're all connected to a private foundation. It's a front for something far more sinister. Everything we've been tracking leads back to this organization." Clint narrowed his eyes. "What's the foundation's name?" Sarah clicked on the link, revealing a name that made Clint's blood run cold. "The Atlas Foundation," she read aloud. "The Atlas Foundation," Clint repeated, the words hanging heavily in the air. It was a name he had heard in passing, a name tied to high-profile philanthropists and influential political figures, but nothing concrete, nothing that would have raised alarm bells. But now, with everything he knew, it made sense. The Atlas Foundation wasn't just a charity or a nonprofit. It was a front, a carefully constructed veil that allowed its true masters to operate freely behind the scenes. "We need to infiltrate them," Clint said, his mind already working through the logistics. "We need to get close to whoever is running that operation. They have to be the key to everything." "We're not exactly equipped for that kind of operation," Sarah cautioned. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. For all we know, this foundation is just a piece of a much bigger puzzle." "We don't have a choice," Clint replied, his voice hard. "If we don't go after them now, we might never get another chance." Later that night, the team prepared to make their move. The Atlas Foundation was headquartered in a lavish building in the heart of Zurich, highly secure, heavily guarded, and virtually impenetrable. Clint knew that breaking into it would be no easy task. They'd need to blend in, gain access to critical information, and extract whatever they could without being caught. It would take careful planning and nerves of steel. As the team gathered in their makeshift war room, Clint laid out the details of their plan. They would need to gather intel on the Foundation's operations, specifically who the key players were. They couldn't risk drawing attention to themselves, so they would infiltrate the Foundation's social circles. This meant attending galas, fundraisers, and other events that the Foundation held to keep up appearances. "We'll need someone on the inside," Clint said, looking around the room, "someone who can gather intel without raising suspicion." The team exchanged looks, and it was Sarah who spoke up first. "I'll do it. I can work the event circuit, get close to their people. I've been doing this kind of thing for years. It won't be easy, but I can manage." Clint gave her a sharp nod. "I know you can, but we'll be right behind you. We can't afford to let our guard down." Sarah didn't flinch. Understood. As the team finalized the plan, Clint felt the weight of the mission settling heavily on his shoulders. They were about to take a huge risk, and they didn't know what they would find inside the Atlas Foundation. What if they weren't prepared for what they uncovered? What if the truth was more dangerous than they could imagine? The clock was ticking, and time was running out. Every second that passed brought them closer to the heart of the conspiracy, and closer to a truth that might shatter everything they thought they knew. And Clint wasn't sure if they'd be able to survive it. That night, as Clint lay in his cot, the weight of the mission pressing down on him, he couldn't help but think about the price of truth. Every revelation so far had led them deeper into the darkness, and yet, there was no turning back. If they were going to stop this, they would have to face the true enemy, and the consequences that came with exposing them. The real question was, would the world ever be ready for the truth? Clint closed his eyes, bracing himself for the storm that was coming. The morning light filtered through the cracks of the abandoned warehouse where Clint and his team had set up their operations. The atmosphere was tense, everyone aware that the next few hours could change the course of everything. Today, they would put their plan into action, infiltrating the Atlas Foundation, the shadowy organization behind everything they had uncovered. Clint stood before a map of Zurich, his finger tracing the route they would take to access the building. The Atlas Foundation's headquarters was a fortress, fortified with high-tech security systems, private security forces, and a network of surveillance that could rival any government agency. They would need to blend in, gather intel, and leave without drawing attention to themselves. One slip-up, and everything could fall apart. "We don't know what we'll find inside," Clint said, his voice low but steady. "This could be the key to everything. We're going in blind, but we don't have a choice. We either take the risk, or we never get another shot at stopping them." Sarah, who had volunteered to go undercover at the Atlas Foundation's upcoming gala, nodded. "I'm ready. I'll get close to whoever's in charge. They'll never know what hit them." Clint's eyes met Sarah's, a silent understanding passing between them. She had done this kind of work before, but this was different. They were walking into the heart of a global conspiracy, and the stakes couldn't be higher. "Good," Clint said, his voice firm. "Once you're inside, we'll be watching. Just stay focused. We need information, nothing else." The team continued to prepare, going over the plan in meticulous detail. Each person had a specific role to play, from hacking into the Atlas Foundation's network to monitoring the event from the outside. It would take all their skills, all their training, to pull this off. But they had no other choice. This was the only lead they had. As evening descended and the gala at the Atlas Foundation's headquarters approached, Clint stood by the door, his hand resting on the cold metal. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, every moment filled with the potential for disaster. But he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. They had come too far to back down. The gala was in full swing when Sarah arrived at the Atlas Foundation's headquarters, a pristine, marble-floored building with towering windows that looked out over the city of Zurich. The event was lavish, a celebration of the Foundation's philanthropic efforts in Africa, according to the invite. But Clint knew the truth. It was all a front. Behind the glittering facade, the Foundation was a hub for shadowy power players who controlled everything from politics to global finance. Sarah adjusted the sleek black dress she wore, her nerves hidden behind a confident smile. She had worked these kinds of events before, mingling with the rich and powerful, getting the inside track without drawing attention. But tonight, there was something different in the air. The stakes were higher. The people she would encounter in that room were not just wealthy elites. They were the architects of the world's darkest secrets. As she entered the main hall, Sarah was immediately struck by the opulence. The room was filled with well-dressed guests, a string quartet playing soft music in the background, and waiters circulating with trays of champagne. It all felt surreal, like she was stepping into a world she wasn't supposed to belong to. "Ah, Miss Harper, I'm so glad you could join us tonight," a deep voice called out from behind her. Sarah turned, her instincts kicking into gear as she smiled and extended her hand. The man in front of her was tall, impeccably dressed, with a chiseled jaw and dark eyes that appraised her with interest. He was one of the Foundation's primary benefactors, but Sarah had done her research. This was Damien Albrecht, a key player in the Atlas Foundation's operations. "Mr. Albrecht," Sarah said, her voice smooth as silk, "it's a pleasure to be here. I've heard so much about the Foundation's work." Albrecht smiled, his eyes flicking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I'm glad to hear that. Please, allow me to show you around. We have many guests tonight who are eager to meet someone with your talents." Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "I'd love that." As they moved through the crowd, Sarah kept her ears open for any mention of the organization's inner workings. She needed to find out who was really in charge, who had the power in this room. But the more she listened, the more she realized that no one here was talking about business or politics. They were too busy discussing the lavish event and the future of the Foundation's charity projects. The real conversations, the ones that mattered, were happening elsewhere. After a few minutes, Albrecht led her to a quieter corner of the room where a small group of men were deep in conversation. Their voices were low, but Sarah could hear the tension in their words. She didn't need to know the specifics. She knew these men were the ones running the show. "Mr. Albrecht, I must excuse myself for a moment," Sarah said, smiling as she made a hasty retreat from the group. As she stepped away, her heart pounded in her chest. She had seen enough. The true leaders of the Atlas Foundation were not just philanthropists. They were deeply embedded in the global elite. They controlled the levers of power, and it was no accident that they had become so influential. The question now was how to bring them down. Back in the safe house, Clint and the rest of the team were monitoring the gala from a nearby location. They had tapped into the security cameras and were following Sarah's every move, tracking her progress as she worked her way deeper into the event. It was going smoothly, too smoothly, Clint thought. "I don't like this," he muttered under his breath. "We've been at this too long. It feels like we're walking into a trap." Marcus's warning from earlier that night echoed in his mind. The real enemy is closer than you think. Clint had a sinking feeling that they were being watched, that they had already been tracked, that this gala, this foundation, was just a baited hook. Just as he was about to relay his concerns to Sarah, the feed went dark. The screens flickered and then went black. Clint's heart rate spiked. "They've cut us off," one of his team members said, his voice filled with urgency. "They're on to us." Clint cursed under his breath. "Get the signal back up. Now." But it was too late. The room went dark. Inside the Atlas Foundation's headquarters, Sarah had just managed to slip away from the main crowd when she felt a cold, steady presence behind her. Before she could react, a hand grabbed her arm, pulling her into a dark hallway. Her heart raced as she struggled, but the grip was firm. "Thought you could sneak around, did you?" a voice hissed. It was Damien Albrecht. His eyes were filled with cold amusement, his grip tightening on her wrist. "Mr. Albrecht," Sarah managed to say, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You don't want to do this." Albrecht's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Oh, but I do. You're far too curious for your own good, Miss Harper. And that curiosity will cost you." The last thing Sarah heard before the darkness took over was the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. Clint slammed his fist against the table, his mind spinning. He had failed to keep an eye on Sarah when it mattered most. They were too deep into the game now. There was no turning back. And the real enemy? They were already one step ahead. Clint's mind raced as he watched the black screens before him. Sarah was missing. The feed had been cut. His heart was hammering in his chest. He had seen the warning signs. There was something off about the smoothness of their infiltration. The Atlas Foundation knew they were there. Sarah had been caught. His instincts told him they were all walking into a trap. The question now was, how could they turn the tables? Clint couldn't let Sarah down. She had gone deep into enemy territory, risking everything to uncover the truth. "Get everything back online now," Clint barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Working on it, boss," Marcus replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "But whoever's behind this is good. They've encrypted everything. We can't get in." "Damn it," Clint muttered, pacing back and forth. His mind raced through all the possibilities. What if Sarah had been captured? What if they were luring him into the same trap now? Then it hit him, the answer that had eluded him before. The Atlas Foundation was the heart of this entire operation. Everything had led to this point. But it wasn't just about bringing down the foundation. It was about exposing the powerful, shadowy figures who lurked behind it all. They needed leverage. They needed a bargaining chip. And Clint had one in mind. "Is the tracking device still active on Sarah?" he asked urgently. "Yes, we still have a trace on her," Marcus responded, scanning the screen. Clint nodded. "We're going in. Prepare the team. We're not letting them take her without a fight." It was dark when Clint and his team arrived outside the Atlas Foundation's headquarters. The place was a fortress. Lights gleamed from the upper floors, but the street outside was deserted, eerily quiet. Clint's breath fogged the air as he surveyed the building with grim determination. "This is it," Clint said, his voice low. "We get Sarah back, and we expose them all." The team moved swiftly into position, each one with a specific task in mind. As Clint approached the back entrance, he took a moment to breathe, focusing on the task at hand. This wasn't just about rescuing Sarah anymore. It was about bringing down the whole corrupt system. Every second counted. They had to move fast and hit hard. "Marcus, hack the security cameras. We need eyes on the inside. We can't risk them knowing we're here until it's too late." A tense silence followed as Marcus worked, tapping into the surveillance system. The digital world of the Atlas Foundation was vast and complicated, but Marcus was a master at cracking codes. Clint knew he could trust him. "I've got access," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "We're good to go. You'll have eyes everywhere inside the building." Clint's pulse quickened as he exchanged a look with Sarah's backup team. They nodded, confirming their readiness. "Time to move," Clint said, his voice steady. "Keep your heads down and stay sharp. We get in, we get out, and we leave nothing behind but chaos." Inside the Atlas Foundation, Sarah was disoriented, her head throbbing as she slowly regained consciousness. Her hands were bound, and she could feel the cold stone floor beneath her. The room around her was dark, and she could hear the faint hum of machinery somewhere in the distance. The air smelled musty, like an abandoned storage facility. Her breath hitched when she remembered the last thing she saw. Damien Albrecht, his eyes gleaming with cold malice, dragging her down the hallway. What had they done to her? How much time had passed? Her heart pounded as she fought against the restraints, trying to focus her mind. She needed to escape, but her head was heavy, and the disorientation made it difficult to think clearly. Then, she heard the sound of footsteps. A door creaked open, and a silhouette appeared in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she recognized the figure. It was Albrecht, but there was someone else behind him, a man she didn't recognize. "You shouldn't have gotten involved, Miss Harper," Albrecht said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've made things complicated." Sarah glared at him, trying to gather her strength. "You'll regret this. Clint won't stop. He'll come for me." Albrecht smiled, an expression that was both chilling and mocking. "Your little team? They're already too late." Sarah's heart sank as the man beside Albrecht stepped forward, revealing a set of documents in his hand. "We're done playing games, Miss Harper," he said, his voice cold. "You can either join us, or you can disappear like everyone else who's gotten too close to the truth." She fought against the restraints again, but the more she struggled, the more helpless she felt. "You won't get away with this," she spat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Albrecht's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Before Sarah could respond, the door to the room burst open with a deafening crash. The sound of gunfire rang out, and the room was plunged into chaos. Sarah barely had time to react as two figures in tactical gear stormed in. "Clint!" she gasped, the relief rushing over her like a tidal wave. Clint was at the front, his face grim and determined, his gun raised and aimed at Albrecht. Behind him, the rest of the team fanned out, weapons drawn and ready for action. The room was a blur of motion as Clint moved swiftly towards Sarah. "Hold on, Sarah. We're getting you out of here," Clint said, his voice urgent as he sliced through her restraints with a tactical knife. Before Albrecht could react, Clint's team quickly subdued him, knocking the guards out of the way with precision and efficiency. Albrecht struggled, but it was clear he was outmatched. "Not so fast," Clint said, his voice cold as he grabbed Albrecht by the collar and lifted him off the ground. "You've been running this operation for too long. It ends tonight." Albrecht sneered, but Clint could see the fear in his eyes. The man knew his time was up. "Let me go, Eastwood," Albrecht hissed. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You can't win this." Clint's eyes locked onto his. "Watch me." He turned to Sarah, who was now on her feet, visibly shaken but unharmed. "We're getting out of here. Now." As the team made their way through the building, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. They had broken into the heart of the Atlas Foundation, but the true enemy, the ones who had been pulling the strings all along, were still out there, hiding in the shadows. The mission wasn't over. It couldn't be. There was still more to uncover. But tonight, Clint had one victory. Sarah was safe, and the Atlas Foundation's mask was shattered. As they raced toward the exit, Clint's thoughts were already shifting to what lay ahead. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and he knew that the truth was much bigger than he had ever imagined. But the fight was far from over. "Clint," Sarah said, her voice steady as she walked beside him, "we've exposed them, but this isn't just about the collective anymore. It's about something far more dangerous. We can't stop now." Clint glanced at her, his expression hardening. "No, we won't stop. Not until we've taken down every last one of them." And with that, they disappeared into the night, knowing the real battle was just beginning. The storm had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?